Mortimer, we're going to be talking about how to read a book, and I brought you some books to read.
What do you mean by reading? Reading
Well,
is a highly ambiguous word. It can mean any number of things.
Yeah.
Do you mean reading for information, reading for just amusement and relaxation, or reading for understanding? Reading by which I'm going to lift my mind up from understanding less to understanding more. Which?
Well, all three. I mean, the books that I brought you, I think, are susceptible of reading in all those three different ways, and
I think I can tell, by the way, by looking at them, which way I want to read them, if I'm going to read them at all. And I brought you some books. You take these and look at these while I look at yours.
All right.
This is a book I've wanted to read for a long time, but read very lightly. It's a book by Merrill Miller, which is the oral biography of Harry S. Truman. I've read reviews of it, and I know what it contains. It's the story of Truman's political life and his presidency, told in the first person by his recording it. I know I want to read that book quickly. It wouldn't take me much time to read it.
This is Toynbee on Toynbee, and there's a long description of the book right on the cover. A conversation between Arnold J. Toynbee and G.R. Urban on topics of perennial and current interest. And since Toynbee is one of the great authors of our century, I am sure that I would want to read that, but not...
Well, I know I don't want to read this. I know that I don't even want to glance at it more than the cover. It's a Rand McNally book all about bicycling. Charles, I'm sorry to tell you, I've never been able to keep my balance on a bicycle. That's
well,
that.
Maybe that would help you to do it.
No, I assure you, no book. This is a how-to book. And no book would ever be able to, I'd never be able to go from a book to staying up on a bicycle.
But what if we ran out of gas completely?
I'd walk.
Right. Oh, you did do well by me, didn't you? Now, here's a book by I.A. Richards, the philosopher. It's called Beyond, the sources and aims of the Western tradition from the Iliad and Job to Plato, Dante, and Shelley. And I think I'd probably want to read that book. It is a complex book with a analytical table of contents, Mortimer, which is something that books used to have.
That's right.
With a quite distinct and well-described analysis of what's in the book. I will read I.A. Richards.
Charles, I've got the last three books you laid out for me, but why did you give me Hamlet? You know I've read that.
Yeah, well, I know you've read it, but
That's a book I'd read carefully. I've read it 10, 15 times already.
There are notes in it.
Oh.
And every page is printed on every other page, and every other page, therefore, contains notes and commentary and so forth.
Well,
and I thought that might be interesting and useful.
Well, Hamlet, against all the books you've given me, this is the only one that I would read, I have read 10, 15 times, perhaps, in the course of years of reading, slowly, carefully, understanding a little more each time I've read it. This is the only book you've given me that I would put in the class of reading for the sake of my mind. The rest, I mean, the sense of improving my mind, understanding my own life and human life better than I would have without reading it. These other books, the Truman book would amuse me, entertain me, and inform me. The other books are strictly books of information. They're not going to teach me anything beyond facts that I don't know. And that seems to me is that distinction between books that one reads for information, or magazines or newspapers, books that one reads for amusement, such as detective stories or light novels or current fiction of some kind or other, and books that one reads to improve one's understanding is very important for the following reason. All of us learn to read in school, and that instruction in reading goes on to the 4th or 6th grade. Now, for most of these books, the kind of reading you learn to do up to the 4th or 6th grade is quite sufficient. You've got enough skill to read the newspaper.
Although you have to practice it. You have to keep on using it.
But to read Hamlet, or to read other books that are worth reading for the sake of improving your mind, you need skills that are not taught in school. In fact, the kind of reading that I think we should be talking about from now on in this is reading that is not taught in school at all. Reading that involves acts of interpretation, acts of analysis, acts of apprehension of content in the book.
And acts of critical judgment.
Right.
After you've finished.
Now, that kind of reading cannot be done quickly.
No, I don't think it can either. How fast would you read Hamlet, Mortimer, if you were reading it...
For the first time?
Well, for the first time, yeah.
I'd read it more quickly the first time than the second and third time. But let me say about the speed of reading that there's no such thing as a right speed. When I'm reading Plato, for example, or Aristotle, I seldom read faster than 20 pages an hour, sometimes slower than that.
Well, that's pretty slow, isn't
In
it?
fact, I would guess, Charles, that reading in the sense, that third sense of reading, reading for the sake of really lifting my mind up from a state of understanding less to understanding more, I doubt if I read 10 books a year. I handle hundreds. I examine many. I get information from a great many. I get pleasure from the books I read at night to go to sleep with. But I assure you, the books that I learn from, in a genuine sense of deepening my mind, gaining insight and some degree of wisdom, I hope, I doubt if I read 10 a year. Because I read them very slowly. It's hard work. I read them at a desk, usually at a desk with pencil and paper, marking the book. And therefore, it seems to me that the whole cult of speed reading is wrong.
Yes, I think you're right.
Instead of talking about speed reading, one should talk about variable speed reading. Everyone should be able to read some things very quickly,
Yeah.
particularly if their purposes are light and transient, and some things very, very slowly. The trouble is that most people don't know how to read slowly enough.
Yes, I think that's true when it comes to a really, really good book. Speed reading is useful for learning how to read business memos or business letters or something of the sort quickly.
I
think that
don't
people
think
can
I'd
gain
recommend
from...
it for contracts or leases.
No, nor for
Everyone should
love
read-
letters.
Or for love letters.
No, love letters should be read very,
Very
very
slowly.
slowly. Now, in the case of Hamlet, for example, suppose you didn't know what that play was and hadn't read it before. You're saying that, first of all, you'd like to find out some things about it from kind of exterior cues, like its title and its author's name and when it was written and,
But let me tell you
its
this,
cast of characters.
This copy of Hamlet you gave me, I wouldn't want. On my first reading of Hamlet, I don't want to be stopped by the notes.
Right.
I don't want footnotes. I want to read it through quickly. In
Right.
fact, my feeling about a difficult book, a book that's worth reading carefully, is that the first time you read it, you read very quickly. That's just the first time, expecting to read it again much more slowly. And quickly in the sense of not being stopped. There are lots of allusions in Hamlet that I wouldn't understand the first time, which the notes would help me understand better.
Right.
But on that first reading, I don't want to understand everything. I want to understand enough to get the whole play in before me.
Because it's so terribly important to understand the whole structure
That's
of a
right.
book before you start to read it in detail and understand it in detail, isn't it?
When I went to high school many, many years ago, we read Julius Caesar, I think the first year of high school. We read it scene by scene, understanding each scene. As a result, I never understood the play as a whole.
Yes.
Well, what they should have done instead of reading it scene by scene first is to read the play through completely and discuss it as a whole, and then go back, perhaps, and read it more carefully, scene by scene, with notes and explanations.
I had the
and so
same
forth.
experience with As You Like It, and as a matter of fact, because my father was a poet and a professor of English and a teacher of Shakespeare, he said, read As You Like It all the way through the night before, and I did it. And I came to school the next day, and the teacher was annoyed with me because I had spoiled her plan. And yet I had done something very important for myself because I was able to understand what she was doing henceforth.
I'm so convinced about this that when I've been reading great books with students or with adults in great book seminars, I always tell them, when I give them a difficult text for discussion to read it through and not be stopped by what they don't understand on the first reading. Because only by reading it through and understanding, let's say 10% or 20% or 30%, will they be able to go back and understand more. One example I'm very fond of is a great treatise in the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, one of the treatises that I think is most instructive, illuminating, the treatise on law. And I've had people that I've asked to read this get stopped because when they get, it's really questions 90 to 97 or 98, about 8 or 9 questions. And on the second of those questions, 92, Article 6 is the question whether there is a law in the foams of sin, F-O-M-E-S.
Foams of
The
sin.
foams of sin.
What are
And
foams?
people stop reading. They say, well, I don't know what foams are. I can't find it in the dictionary, a small dictionary. And so they stop reading because they can't understand that particular passage. And I've said to them, first place, if you don't understand that one passage, it will not affect your general grasp of the treatise on law. In the second place, if you look at the context, you'll get some sense of the foams of sin, the passions. You'll see the discussion here of the passions as the sources of the animal passions, as the sources of original sin, the causes of Adam's fall. And after you've read the treatise on law through, you'll be able to go back and understand better why St. Thomas asks whether there's a law in the foams of sin. But people who get stopped by that, or for example,
What is foams? Now, what does the word mean?
foams are substances that communicate infection, infectious substances,
I see.
and the passions infect us with sin, you see.
Right. But you can understand that in a general way
Yes.
as well as you have
But if
to
you-
understand it from the context.
But if you didn't, it wouldn't
Yeah.
make any difference because it's only one question, and if you to stop there
Yeah.
is to defeat yourself entirely. Go on reading, you see.
Another example of that is the first canto of the Divine Comedy of Dante. Many people get hung up on that first canto because as Dante is traveling through the world, he comes to himself in the middle of a dark wood in the middle of the journey of his life, and he meets a leopard and a she-wolf and a lion. And these are highly allegorical figures, and Dante doesn't really explain what they mean. And I have known readers who said, I can't go on because I don't know what those animals mean. It does not matter. As a matter of fact, Dante really never explains what they mean. But if you go on just a little bit more, Dante meets Virgil, and Virgil is the most important character after Dante and Beatrice in the book, and then the story unfolds. But don't get stuck at the beginning.
Now, you know, if you follow me in this distinction between reading for amusement or entertainment, relaxation, and reading just for information, on the one hand, and reading for understanding, for deepening your mind, acquiring insight, lifting your mind up from a lower level to a higher level, then I think it's terribly important for each of us, for everyone, to find a number of books that are over their heads. Because if a person reads only books that are on the level of his head, he can't lift his head up. It's the books that are over one's head, the books which one only partially understands at first and must work at to understand more, that can possibly elevate you. You can't lift yourself up with things at your level or below your level.
You can't chin yourself on a bar that's below your
Yeah, but
below
most
your
people
shoulder.
say that's over my head,
Yeah.
as if that immediately dismisses it. On the contrary, what's over your head you should go after.
Right. If you pick up a book and you find it's too tough for you, you shouldn't throw it aside. I mean, that's what you're looking for. You should be happy when you find a book that's too hard for you, because that's a book that you can grow with. That's a book that you can lift yourself up with.
And the art of reading consists in knowing how to do just that.
Right.
The art of reading, I'd like to say, consists in having the skills required for lifting your mind up with a book, and nothing but a book in your hand, from understanding less to understanding more.
Mortimer, you're a smart guy. Why does it take you so long to read?
Well, it sometimes takes me long and sometimes a short time to read a book. I can read 10 books in one day in the sense of inspecting them, finding out what they're about and putting them on my shelf for future reference.
And deciding whether you want to read them or not.
Carefully or not. But just as I can read 10 books in one day, sometimes it takes me 10 days to read one book, or even longer than 10 days, because I'm really working at it. I'm trying to make that book part of myself. I'm trying to find out everything it says and understand everything it means and think about and criticize what I've learned from it. And when I do that, I'm working. I'm not just sitting back in a chair idly. I'm not about to go to sleep. I usually read books that way at my desk with a pad and paper, always with seldom without a pen or pencil in my hand. And often I find that at the end of an hour or two, I have to stop because I'm so, in a sense, weary of the work that I have to take a rest before I go on reading. And what I do with a pencil in my hand, the pad, is to make notes in the book or about the book on a piece of paper. And I think that no one is really reading in the sense of getting the book into his mind if he doesn't do that. Just to sit there with the book in your hand and your eyes open, turning the pages, probably with your mind wandering, is not reading in my sense of the term reading.
What's that book there?
Well, I have here 3 books that I read carefully. These two 50 years ago, this one 40 years ago. These two I read in college when I was a student at Columbia, studying with John Dewey, and I'll tell you a story about that later. One is Reconstruction philosophy, and the other is William James's Meaning of Truth.
Right.
Both pragmatic philosophers. And this, shortly after I began teaching, I became acquainted with the great French philosopher Jacques Maritain. This is a book called Art and Scholasticism. Let me tell you, let me show you what I did in this book, for example. First place, you will see here, in my unformed childish handwriting, a series of pages of notes that I made on a pad just like that while I was reading the book.
Incidentally, by the way, before you go on, here's an example of that I did that I just discovered by going through my library. It's a book about William Cooper, the man I wrote a dissertation about. I filled up the inside of the front cover with notes, but then that wasn't nearly enough, so I needed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages, which I cut down so that they would fit inside the book.
Well, and then in the book itself, there are underlined, I put a mark in the margin to indicate that paragraph I want to call attention to, or I underlined words, and sometimes not only underlined words, but wrote down on the bottom margin of the page my own observations, my own comments on the thing, so that here at the end of the chapter is a set of notes. Now, the interesting thing about that, Charles, is that they were useful at the time. If, for example, I were to read this book now for discussion, or I would have to read it, I really want another copy. By the way, one of the reasons why I seldom use a library book, I often use library books, but when I want to do this kind of reading with them, I have to buy the book. Because I can't mark a library book, and if I don't mark a book, I don't think I've got it, you see.
Actually, when you read a book this carefully, you are establishing a proprietary right in any way.
You better own it.
You have brought it into your own mind, so you better own it.
But if I wanted to read this book again for the purposes of teaching it or using it in some research, I'd want another copy to mark it freshly. These earlier markings would annoy me, because though they might be helpful, I might be interested in finding out what I thought then. 50 years later, I think something different.
Well, the marks in the book are not the record, then, for you to refer back to.
No, I don't. And they're not there for memory's sake. They're there because it was part of the act of reading at the time.
They do remind you of how carefully you read. I, going through my library, I found a copy of the Iliad of Homer, where I had marked almost every page. I think I made a kind of running index of the book. I was writing something about the Iliad at the time. This was 25 years ago. There was an index of this, but it was not satisfactory to me. I had to make my own index as I went along of the plot and of the characters as they acted in various ways in the book. So up at the top of many of the pages, most of the pages, I have written a description of what happens on this page. I am amazed at what I said. I no longer think it's true, but that's not the important thing. What I know is that I really read that book to a fairly well.
That's exactly the same in this case of William James's essays on the meaning of truth. Both the front and back covers of the book are loaded with notes referring to pages, and of course the book itself is marked, underlined, asterisks. But let me say one thing about that, if I may. I, as you know, conduct these seminars at Aspen, summer after summer. I've been doing it for the last 25 years. And many of the readings are the same summer after summer, so I've read the selections that are discussed in the seminar 25 or more times. And each time I do it, I make notes. But I can't use last year's notes. I have a whole file of notes going back many, many years with the dates on them. But each time that I conduct that seminar, I read the thing again. The selection is fairly short, 30 or 40 pages. Make another set of notes, because as I've grown older, my own mind has changed, and therefore I've got to do the reading again, the thinking again, and the note-making again to be current.
Right. Here's Walter Bagehot's Physics and Politics, and the important chapter in this book, there are 5 chapters, is the last one, and at a certain point in this chapter, Bagehot begins to give the core, the heart of his argument. And what I did here was to mark the key sentences in the argument. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and finally, one page later, 14, which is the key sentence of all. And I have that as an eternal record of the heart and meaning of this book.
Recently, reading a book that interests me considerably, written by a professor at Harvard called Reflections on the Causes of Human Misery and Upon Certain Proposals to Eliminate Them, a book dealing with current economic and social problems. I did a very elaborate marking. As you can see, in this case here, I put question marks in the margin. I often put question marks when a sentence or a statement by an author puzzles me. And in some cases, there's a great deal of underlining here, but in one or two cases, I put down, at the beginning on page 171, underlining asterisk 1, meaning that's the first point in the series of arguments, very much as you did in another case, and that goes on with asterisks and words encircled.
And you've turned down the corner of the page, haven't you?
And then there's asterisk and 2 and asterisk and 3, so that I've got a series of sentences there that I want to call my own attention to as the sequence of an argument.
Here's a copy of The Nature of the Universe by Lucretius, or On the Nature of Things, De Rerum Natura. It contains an analytical table of contents made by the translator. That is a table of contents that doesn't just give titles of chapters, but describes...
Outlines the content of chapter
outlines
by
the
chapter.
contents of the work. And it's very useful and very well done by the translator, but it's not my analytical table of contents, and I was teaching the book and working very hard on it, so I had to make my own. So I made my own analytical table of contents, which is somewhat different from the translator's, although in many respects, of course, it's the same, because I'm dealing with the same book.
Wouldn't you say that a student who is reading the book that you were teaching should do exactly the same kind of work?
That's right, and he should argue with me if his notion of what the book says is different from mine.
Reverse of that picture, that's why I never like to lend books to anybody.
Right.
I not only don't like to use library books because I can't mark them, but I don't want to lend you this book. If you want to read The Meaning of Truth, you go out and buy your own. Because I don't want you to be affected by my notes, as you would be.
Right.
You couldn't help be affected by all the markings on the page.
I might say to myself, Mortimer Adler is crazy, he has misunderstood this. Listen, what was your story about John Dewey?
Well, at about the time that I was reading this book, John Dewey had just come back from China, was teaching a course at Columbia. I was, I think, a junior or a senior. And his lectures were relatively slow tempo, so I could take down in notes almost everything he said. I'd go home and type these notes up and read them carefully and mark them. Then I'd write a letter. Dear Dr. Dewey, I would say, dear Professor Dewey, in today's lecture you said such and such, but it seems to me you were inconsistent with what you said 2 days before. Would you please explain? And Professor Dewey would come to class and say, a student in this class has written me a letter, and then he'd read the letter and explain. And then I'd go home and write another note saying, because I was carrying on a series of conversations with Dewey until he was so sometimes plagued by this, he said, I wish the student that's writing me this letter would stop. But actually what you're doing when you're marking your book is exactly that. You're carrying on a one-sided conversation with the author. In fact, I think that reading is that kind of thing.
Is that unfair? Does
No,
he...
no.
Well, how do you ensure that the author's view is adequately represented in your conversation?
You can't ensure that. But
that's your effort, isn't it? Because your first task in reading a book is to get as truly and correctly as possible what the author is saying.
Correct. But nevertheless, one of the reasons why perhaps having two people read the same book together is that they would make the conversation a little less one-sided. If I told you what I was saying to John Dewey, you could say, but I don't think Dewey says that, and the conversation would become more amplified. But you know, what all this comes to, Charles, is, I think, something that most people don't realize because they don't engage in reading in this way, that reading is a very, very active process.
Yeah.
Most people think of writing as if writing, because they can see that a person to write has to take a typewriter out of a piece. He's doing something. But they think of reading as sitting back passively and having the words somehow go through the eyes and into the mind, and no activity. After all, you're just sitting still. But reading is just as active as writing.
Yeah.
And I often like to think of the analogy of pitching and catching in a baseball game.
The catcher who kneels down there behind the batter is not passive.
He's receiving, but not passive. He's actively receiving, just as the pitcher is actively throwing. So the writer is actively communicating, and the reader is actively receiving the communication. But the actions are correlative and proportional to one another, but the activities are equally intense on both sides.
It's a good catcher that makes a good pitcher, and I suppose we're saying here that a good reader makes a good author in some sense.
The reverse is also true. A good catcher can't catch a bad pitcher.
Yeah, yes, that's true.
And some of the rules of reading that I think we're concerned with in this making the art of reading clear apply only to books that are well written.
Yeah.
Because if the book isn't well written enough, the rules won't work. Just as a good catcher with great skill can't catch a bad pitcher.
Right.
It's
very important to emphasize this, isn't it? That we're not recommending that you take a pencil and mark a book and indicate the points in order. If it's a book you're reading just for pleasure or amusement or entertainment, or if it's a book you're just reading for information.
How silly it would be to mock a detective story.
Right, yes.
Or make notes about a detective story.
But when you're reading to elevate your understanding, when it's your mind that's involved, and when you want to really come to grips with what the author says.
Then you better make the book your own.
Right.
And you don't make it your own just by buying it.
No.
Because that's just as a piece of physical property you put on the shelf. You make it your own by putting yourself into it.
Yeah.
And you put yourself into it by mocking it.
Mortimer, the first thing that a good reader does when he approaches a book is to come to terms with the author. Isn't that right?
There's a reason for it. Authors often use the key words in their writing with very special meanings. And unless the reader notes what those special meanings are, he will not understand what the author's trying to say. It's impossible. Most words in the dictionary are ambiguous. They have many meanings. And many words are used in common speech in one way and by authors in quite a different way. And so the reader's task is to find out precisely the meaning with which the author is using an important word in his text, and the author often calls attention to what he's doing. For example, let me give you an example from Thomas Hobbes, a book called The Leviathan, book in political philosophy written in the 17th century.
Leviathan, the title is not a term.
That was Hobbes' way of referring to the state as a great mammoth.
Right.
And the words in this case are very familiar words, words that you and I and everybody else use every day: war and peace. And when you think about how we use war, we speak of a war going on when men are fighting one another, bombs are being dropped, cities are being destroyed.
And peace is when that's not going on.
And that's not going on. But Hobbes says no. Or he calls your attention to the fact that there's another meaning for the word. He says, during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe under government, they are in that condition which is called war. For war consists not in battle only. Now that not is effective.
Right.
Most of us think that war consists in battle or fighting, or in the act of fighting. But an attractive time, a period of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lies not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consists not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto during all the time there is no assurance to the contrary.
Right.
I want you to notice all of the time is peace, says Hobbes. What Hobbes is doing here in the 17th century is calling our attention to a meaning of war that we have only come recently to give a name to. We call it the Cold War.
Right.
When men are not actually fighting, but are disposed to fight, are on edge with one another, and would fight if the conditions changed and required it.
And in the Middle East, there's been a condition of either cold or hot war going on for 25 years. And Hobbes would say that's war all the way through.
Now, the meaning of peace is a little, he really always defines war and says all other time is peace.
Right.
But notice, what he means by peace, then, is civil peace. The kind of peace that exists in the United States, in California, in Illinois, in Chicago, in New York, where people are living under government, where they can settle their differences by recourse to law, by recourse to government rather than to fighting.
So even if they are fighting with one another in one way or another, that's
contending.
They're contending, but in a condition of peace.
Without resort to force or violence.
Right, right.
That is the meaning of peace.
Right.
Not just the absence of fighting, but the ability to settle differences without recourse to fighting.
Now, is Hobbes consistent throughout the Leviathan in using the words war and peace in that way?
He is, indeed.
That's not true, of course, of all authors, even of authors of great books. Dante in the Divine Comedy, I think that War and Peace are two of the really critical terms for Hobbes and the Leviathan. In the Divine Comedy, the critical word is love. The whole of the Divine Comedy consists of 100 cantos, and the very central 50 and 51 out of the 100 are a definition of love. Dante not only uses the word in practically every canto, but well, a description of love.
Yes.
Dante says to Virgil, "What is love?" And Virgil replies, "This is what love is." Although it's a little bit ambiguous even there, but certainly he's pointing to the importance of this term. But you could just as well discover that love changes its meaning throughout the poem by reading it straight through and discovering, for example, in the 5th canto of the Inferno, in hell, that Francesca is there in hell because of her love. Her love is wrongly directed. It is a love that tends toward lust. Now, when you come to the purgatory, you find another lady, La Pia, who is in purgatory because of her love. It's different from Francesca's love. It is transitory. It is not permanent. She only had it for a moment just before she died. And then finally you come in heaven to another famous lady, Picarda, who has still another kind of love. This one is incomplete. It's lukewarm. It is not sufficient, but it is rightly directed, and it was rightly directed throughout her life, so she is in heaven. But she's in a lower level of heaven.
So love is not a single term in Dante. It's a whole series of terms.
It's a whole series. It has a whole series of meanings.
And the reader, the good reader of Dante, must play up and down that series of terms.
And follow Dante along as though he were chasing a rabbit to catch him as he changes.
Now, authors, Hobbes doesn't say definition. He just introduces it by saying war does not consist in battle only or in the act of fighting. And you know he has a special meaning of war. Now, Aristotle, in the book on physics, which is concerned with motion, when he gets to saying exactly what motion is, puts the word definition down. So you know he wants you to come to terms with him here. And it's not an easy definition. He says that motion is the actualization of what exists potentially insofar as it exists potentially. Now, that's not easy. But let me just explain that for a moment. Let me take this pen, and I roll it across the table. It started out being here at rest. I push it, now it's at rest again. But while it was in motion, it was an actualization of its being in the next place, while it still has potentiality for going on to the next place until it stops, and then it's completely actually there and no longer in motion.
Right.
Now, in addition to his defining motion in that very special way, the actualization of potency while it's still in potency.
Those are tough words.
They are indeed. He also calls our attention to the fact that he's using motion in a way that we don't use in ordinary speech. He says motion includes, I mean the word motion to cover alteration, the changing of an apple or a leaf from green to red as the autumn comes on, or increase and decrease, the blowing up of a balloon, getting larger in size, or coming to be and passing away, a child being born or an animal dying. And only one of the meanings is local motion, or this kind of motion
which is what we ordinarily think of motion as being. Right.
Well, we ordinarily use the word change for those 4 kinds of things and use motion for one of them, but he says, I'm going to use the word motion for all 4. And unless you do that, you aren't paying attention to what Aristotle means, and you haven't come to terms with him, and you won't understand this text.
Actually, you don't have to agree with his meaning. It doesn't matter whether you think he's right in the word, in the meaning that he gives to the word, but if you agreeing or not, you have to follow him the way he goes.
Well, unless you know what his meaning is, you can't tell whether he's right or wrong.
That's right. You're not reading the book. And the book, Physics, the physics of Aristotle, is about nature. Physics means nature, doesn't it? And nature is the realm in which things change. The play King Lear of Shakespeare is also about nature. It's often been pointed out by good readers of that play that that's a word that's used about 60 or 70 or 100 times in the course of the play. Its meaning, too, changes. But, of course, Shakespeare is not so explicit in saying to you as Aristotle is, watch for the changes, see what I'm doing.
But you know, Charles...
Well, wait a minute, Maura. For example, Lear often talks about nature, his natural children, his unnatural children, their unnatural actions toward him, their persecution of him, and so forth. And there he's referring to human nature. But in the 3rd act, at the beginning of the 3rd act, Lear is subjected to the persecution of the heavens when the terrible storm on the heath comes, and that's external nature. Now, the word is not used. Shakespeare doesn't use the word to refer to nature, but we know that that's another meaning of nature which is put into the play.
But poets are at the one extreme of the spectrum. The opposite extreme is that of the mathematician. I mean, here's Shakespeare playing up and down the scale on that word nature,
Right.
but when you read Euclid's elements of geometry, you have no doubt what he means because he starts the book off by saying definitions. The opening page is definitions, and there are, in this case, 23 of them. He starts out by saying, a point is that which has no part. A line is a breadthless length. Then he comes to a definition of a straight line, which we learned in school was the shortest distance between 2 points. But he says a straight line is a line which lies evenly with the points on itself, as if you looked along there and you see that the points didn't get off the line.
Right.
Now, mathematicians write that way. Newton writes that way, too. He opens the great work in natural philosophy with a set of definitions. And there, when the term is defined, the author sticks to it throughout the text, and you have very little difficulty coming to terms with them.
Mathematics is hard to read for other reasons, but it's easy to read.
In that sense.
In this sense, because the author does stick with his meaning. Of course, I don't prefer it. I prefer an author to challenge me with unannounced and unidentified changes of meanings. That's why I like poetry so much, because I have to follow the author. You probably prefer the mathematical or philosophical style of writing, don't you?
I do indeed. But in either case, we have the problem of reading is the problem of overcoming the difficulties of language.
Yeah.
See, if language were like a pane of glass through which a beam of light passed, and if when you spoke and I listened, or you wrote and I read, the words passed from you to me, carrying their meanings clearly, there'd be no art in reading at all.
Yeah.
But language is not that kind of pane of glass, that translucent medium. It's a barrier, it's a wall, it's a mountain. It stands between you and me. The words don't come through clearly. I must tunnel through as you're trying to tunnel through to me, and only when, using the engineering analogy, the two tunnelings meet do we communicate, and have I come to terms with you and you with me.
And of course, very often as you're tunneling through, you hope it doesn't happen in engineering, but you miss.
That's right.
You miss, and then you have failed to communicate.
exactly what happens.
And you have failed to have something common between you and the author.
It happens most of the time, as a matter of fact.
Many times, a term in a work is not just a single word.
No, it can be a phrase.
Yeah.
For example, in the Declaration of Independence, that marvelous phrase, the consent of the governed. In Darwin's Origin of Species, survival of the fittest, or
Or the struggle for existence.
Struggle for
right?
existence.
Or in the case of Kant, that phrase that everybody likes so much, the thing in itself.
Ding an sich.
The Ding an sich, yeah. Now, how do you find these, Mortimer?
Sometimes the author calls attention, as Euclid does, or even Aristotle, by saying definition. Sometimes the way Hobbes does it, by saying, bringing you up sharp by saying, war does not consist in battle only or in the act of fighting. Then you know he's got to, since you come to the book thinking that's what war does consist in, you realize he's saying something different.
Right.
But sometimes it's not nearly so clear.
Well,
sometimes you have to search it out.
Sometimes you find a term in a work by being puzzled by it. If a word is repeated over and over again, and you don't quite know what it means, then probably that's a term of the author. It might be just a name of something that you didn't recognize. That wouldn't be so important. But if it's a term, if it's a word that seems to be repeated over and over again in the author's discourse, and you don't quite get it, then you better find it or you're going to lose the book as a whole. And the way to find it, of course, is to read around it, isn't it?
Context often helps.
Yes, the context will help. You use other words that you do understand to recognize the meaning of the words you don't understand.
When I mark a book, I usually try to spot those words and mark those words first of all, either by encircling them or underlying them. I sometimes make a list of them because I know that unless I really find out what the author means by those particular words or phrases, I will not have come to terms with them, I will not have understood them, and the act of communication will have failed.
Mortimer, I'm going to play a game with you. You play it with me. I'm going to give you a sentence and ask you to state its meaning in your own words.
Right.
And then you do the same to me. This is a statement that Hamlet makes to Horatio in the play Hamlet. Very famous quote, but often misunderstood. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
I would say that Hamlet is saying, your understanding of the world, Horatio, is not adequate. There are more things than you understand.
In other words, you're emphasizing the word your.
Yes,
in that.
your, Horatio's philosophy.
No, it isn't that.
Oh, I see.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
Oh, he might have said, there are more things in heaven and earth than philosophers can understand.
That's right, because there are
I see.
ghosts and
In other words,
spirits and things like
your
that.
isn't the personal your.
And
here.
philosophy means material philosophy. It means, because Hamlet is throughout that play a materialist.
I see.
As you'll see in a moment.
Well, let me try you on one then.
Right.
In the Middle Ages, the great theologians and the philosophers were very fond of saying again and again, nothing acts except it is actual. What does that mean to you? Say that in your own words now. Nothing acts except it is
It means I can't be hurt by something that is only potential. Unless something actually is, it can't hurt me. That's
something
another way.
exists that can't hurt you. Now give me an example of what. Show me that you understand that by giving me a concrete example of something that can't hurt you because it isn't actual.
Well, a possible thunderstorm can't wet me.
Precisely. Next little sentence I'd like to try you on is one of my favorite sentences in Rousseau's Social Contract, where he's referring back to Aristotle's doctrine that some men are by nature slaves. And he says, refers to Aristotle's doctrine, and then he says, about that doctrine that some men are by nature slaves, Aristotle was right, but he took the effect for the cause.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That is to say, he thought because men act like slaves,
Slavishly.
therefore they really are slaves, whereas what Rousseau meant was because they're treated like slaves, they then act like slaves.
In other words, he's charging Aristotle with having confused nature and nurture.
Right.
Aristotle should not have said some men are by nature slaves,
Right.
but some men are by nurture slaves.
Yeah, that's very good. That's a better way to do it. Finally, two sentences from Hamlet, but they come right together. Hamlet's last words to Horatio. The rest is silence. Hamlet dies. Horatio says, good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. And beautiful, beautiful statement. But can you elucidate the two sentences?
Well, Hamlet is saying, when I'm dead, I'm dead.
Yeah.
No more.
Right.
And Horatio is saying, oh no, sweet prince, there's another world to which you will be escorted by angels.
Yeah, it's kind of not fair because Hamlet is dead and can no longer argue.
Answer.
But in fact, that argument between Hamlet and Horatio runs throughout the play. Hamlet is a materialist. Horatio is a Christian, and who believes in the immortality of the soul. And if you don't catch those key sentences, you don't you don't see the metaphysical argument and the religious argument that's going on throughout the play.
I have one more sentence from you, for you rather. It's from Machiavelli. There are two ways of contesting, of quarreling, differing. There are two ways of contesting, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse to the second. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince to understand how to avail himself of the beast and of the man.
That's a terrible statement, isn't it? It means that we, in the war of life, which we all live, we cannot afford to be wholly human. We also have to be bestial. And what we're doing here, of course, is to find, we first have to find and then elucidate in our own words the key sentences in a book. If we don't do that, we're going to not be able to capture the author's meaning.
I think, particularly in expository books, the author helps us to find his key sentences, and our job is not to find them, but to understand them. I think more often, in the books you've been referring to, in the poetical books, it is more difficult. The author doesn't underline the sentence for you. For example, I have a book here which is recent publication, a book about the environmental crisis, very good book indeed by Barry Commoner called The Closing Circle. And Commoner does it. He does it by, look, Charles, he does it by putting right in the center of the page the first law, the second law.
Right.
Let me read you the four laws. Everything is connected to everything else is the first law.
Right.
And the second one is everything must go somewhere. And the third one is nature knows best. And the fourth one is there is no such thing as a free lunch. Now again, the reader can't possibly miss the sentences, but that's not enough. In fact, they're elliptical, they're tantalizing. What does he mean by everything? There's no such thing as a free lunch,
right,
as a basic law of nature.
Yeah, and part of the pointing to the key sentence on the part of the author is this tantalizing quality.
Precisely.
Yeah, he wants to engage your attention, to make you ask a question and wonder what he means.
And I think it's very successful because since you are caught, perplexed by those elliptical and enigmatic sentences, you then read very carefully to find out why he says there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Right.
Other authors do it somewhat differently. For example, in the Middle Ages, one of the great works in the 13th century is Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which is voluminous. And yet it's divided into hundreds and hundreds of questions. And each question being asked, the author points out his answer. He always begins by giving you the wrong answer first.
Right.
Say objection 1, objection 2, and that signals that he's giving you the wrong answer. And then when he finishes with the wrong answers, he says, on the contrary, I answer that. Now, you can't miss his sentence because he said, now, having told you what the wrong answers are, I'm going to tell you what the right answer is, and he lays it out. But again, finding the key sentence in this case is easy because the author's helped you to find it. Then the challenge to you, or the task for you, is to understand it. And what we did at the beginning in that little game we played, I think illustrates what must be done to understand it. You've got this, let me go back a moment and say something else, Charles Sloane. I used to give oral examinations at St. John's in Chicago, and one of the reasons why an oral examination is so much better than a written examination is the professor can never, in a written examination, say to the student, what did you mean by these words? But in an oral examination, the student often repeats words he's read in a book. And you say, now, Mr. Jones, what you just said is exactly what Hobbes said, or what Darwin or Locke said. Now tell me in your own words what Locke or Hobbes or Darwin meant. And then the student who's remembered the words perfectly can't tell you in his own words.
No.
And you know he hasn't understood the sentence.
Right, he's just memorized.
Or sometimes he actually can do it. And then you say, that's very good, Mr. Jones, but now give me a concrete example of it.
Yeah.
And he fails to do that. Now, those are the two tests I've always used to be sure the student really grasped the meaning of the key sentence.
You talk about students, but this is in fact what every reader, every good reader has to do.
All of my students, by the way, are readers.
Yeah, well,
they wouldn't be students unless they were.
A student is a reader. Yeah. The examples you've been giving there in this kind of test is particularly good for expository works, works of philosophy, history, and so forth. But poets, dramatists, have different ways of pointing out the key sentences or the key statements in their works. In Macbeth, for example, there's a marvelous interchange. My father always used to remind me of this. King Duncan comes in, and he's just had to execute the Thane of Cawdor, who was a traitor. And he says of him, "There's no art to tell the mind's construction in the face. He was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust." That's a nice statement. He's expressing his regret about the treachery of the previous Thane of Cawdor. The next statement in the play is, "Enter Macbeth." And in fact, Macbeth enters upon that line. That's his entrance line. And, well, of course, within 24 hours, he has murdered Duncan himself. He was a man in whom Duncan had an absolute trust, but a man who betrayed him much more terribly than the Thane of Cawdor ever did.
There the sentence is a dramatic confrontation.
Right. And you understand that that's what the play is really about,
Sure.
because Macbeth at the beginning of that play is a man in whom one can have an absolute trust, but the corruption of Macbeth, the lessening of his trustworthiness is the course of the action.
Precisely.
Now, a lyric poet does this even differently. He does not have the device of dramatic action, so he has to do it in words, and the sound of words becomes very important. There's a famous example in Milton's Lycidas, which, among other things, yeah, everybody read it in high school, but not everybody reads it as carefully as they should. Among other things, this poem is about the clergy. the corrupt clergy on the one hand and the honest and devout clergy on the other hand, because Lycidas stands for a friend. This is a poem about a friend of Milton's who died when he was very young, and he would have been a good clergyman instead of a bad one. And in referring to the bad ones, Milton talks about their sermons. And he talks about the way the people listen. And when they list, their lean and flashy songs, that is, of the corrupt clergy, grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw. And that's a
Grate, G-R-A-T-E?
Yeah, as though you were grating cheese. And the noise, the sound, the words that they say grate on their minds, and they are of no worth to them. On the other hand, when Milton finally talks about Lycidas himself, who is his friend, he says, and when he goes to heaven, he will hear the unexpressive nuptial song in the blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love. There entertain him all the saints above in solemn troops and sweet societies. And the difference in sound between in solemn troops and sweet societies
and
grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw is an expression.
Those are hard words. Grate on their scrannelled pipes.
Scrannel pipes. Nobody knows quite what that word means. He may have even made up the word.
But the sound is, you're quite right. The contrasting sounds, they do it.
The contrasting sounds indicate the contrasting moral conditions. And if you don't get that contrast, if you don't catch it, you have not really understood one of the main themes of Lycidas.
You know, Charles, this attention we've been paying here to sentences is secondary in a sense, because the first thing you have to do is catch the important words.
Yeah, come to terms.
Yeah. And those important words often occur in the important sentences. In the case of the words, it's really getting their meaning. In the case of the sentences, understanding what's being said. And so that you've got a second level of interpretation here.
Right.
Words or terms, sentences, propositions, really.
Right.
And then, of course, there's still a third level, namely the level of the sequence of sentences, the sentences in the book that put together, hanging together in a sequence, form a whole coherent argument, whether it be a book of poetry or an expository book.
Right. And if you fail to do that, if you fail to identify the terms and then the key sentences and then put them together in a sequence, you have failed really to understand the book.
Sometimes, Charles, an author doesn't mark his sentences for you the way the commoner does by putting the sentence in the center of the page and saying, this is the important sentence. A very difficult book indeed to read is Rousseau's Social Contract, because it's very tightly written.
And with enormous style.
Yeah. But you've got to find his key sentences. I've read this book a good many times, I would guess.
How many times?
I would guess in the last 50 years, 20, 25 times. And over the years of reading it, I think I've found the key sentences which, if you put them together, as you must put them together, make the argument for Book 1 of the Social Contract. Let me read you what I've picked out as the key sentences in that first book. The first one is the opening sentence of Chapter 2. The most ancient of all societies, and the only, emphasize the word only, one that is natural, is the family. And even so, the children remain attached to the father only so long as they need him for their preservation.
Yeah.
Now, when they grow up, the family is dissolved.
The key words are only natural and need.
That's right.
Right.
Now, the second sentence, which occurs as the opening sentence of Chapter 3, makes a different point. But these two sentences then carry on into the third, fourth, and fifth sentence. Second sentence of importance is, the strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right and obedience into duty.
Right in the sense of lawfulness or legitimacy or whatever.
Legitimate authority.
Right.
And that point is carried off into the next key sentence, which is the opening sentence of Chapter 4. Listen to it carefully now. Since no man has a natural authority over his fellow.
A natural authority, right.
By nature, he doesn't have authority over another man. Mm-hmm. And since force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men.
Because force does not create a law, lawfulness or a legitimate authority. Right, okay.
And finally, the last two sentences. He has supposed that men are living in a state of nature, not in a state of civil society. And he says, I suppose men to have reached the point at which the obstacles in the way of their preservation in the state of nature show their power of resistance to be greater than the resources at the disposal of each individual for his maintenance in that state. That primitive condition can thus subsist no longer.
That is, they can't live in the state of nature anymore because they'll die.
And the human race would perish
Right.
unless it changed its manner of existence. But now if we go back to the first sentence, which makes the family natural because we need it for our preservation, then the state is equally natural, is it not?
Right, and because we need it. Right.
Now,
Okay.
having put those, the state being natural, but force creating no right, the last sentence of these five states the problem we have to solve. The problem, says Rousseau, is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, you and I joining together, all of us forming a state, in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before.
Yeah.
Now, how he solves that problem is of course,
Right. But what you've done here is to take a whole book. It's a book out of, it's several pages long,
Yes.
10 pages long.
That's right.
And you have found the key sentences which added up make the argument
Of book one.
Of book one, yeah.
Now,
It's a very hard thing to do, Mortimer. It's probably very hard to follow it as you read it. I mean, you should have the text in front of you, but you have to make the effort to do it, don't you?
yes, because if you don't do that, you're just reading page after page with no buildup of argument.
Right.
Now, you know, Charles, sometimes in this task of finding the author's important sentences, you come upon a quite different situation. That is, the examples we've had so far are examples where the sentences build up constructively, cumulatively, to make an argument to which each sentence contributes. But sometimes when you read a book, you find sentences that puzzle you because within a few pages, what is said in one sentence appears to be contradicted by what is said in another. Let me, this is an extraordinary document, by the way. This is
what
the
is it?
preamble of the Mechanics' Union of Trade Associations in 1827 in Philadelphia.
Oh, yes,
one of the
that's right.
earliest papers of a labor union. And the mechanics say, it's written almost in the tone of the Declaration of Independence, on the first of these pages, do not all the streams of wealth which flow in every direction and are emptied into and absorbed by the coffers of the unproductive, that is the capitalists, the owners of, exclusively take their rise in the bones, marrow, and muscles of the industrious classes.
Right, okay.
They're saying, yes, labor is the sole producer of wealth.
Right.
Now then, having said that, one page later they said, no, at the present period, when wealth is so easily and abundantly created that the markets of the world are overflowing with it, and when, in consequence thereof, and of the continual development and increase of scientific power and technology, the demand for human labor is gradually and inevitably diminishing. Let's listen to that. Here they've said, is not labor the sole source of wealth? And a page later they say, because of modern technology,
Yeah, the technology is
increasing,
is
and
a
labor
source of-
is being less in demand. Well, both of those can't be true.
Right.
Now, the great advantage, I always like to emphasize this point, of finding a contradiction like that.
Yeah, what do you do when you find
Well,
it?
what's wonderful
You
is...
throw the book away?
No, on the contrary, you just hold it to your breast and say, one of those two things must be true. They both can't be true.
Well, they can't both be true. Could they both be false?
Yes, this is not a strict...
If they're a strict contradiction, one of them has to be false and the other true.
But these both can't be true.
Right.
And so you're asking yourself, which is true if either is true?
Right.
And then still within the ambit of a few pages, within our second page, they go on to say, it is neither our intention nor desire to extort inequitable prices for our labor. All we demand is a full and fair equivalent, our share.
Yeah.
But they said at the beginning that we are the sole producers of wealth. They
So
should have asked for all of it.
They should have it all.
This is a book by Jacob Bernofsky. It's called The Identity of Man, about man in relation to the rest of nature. And Bernofsky begins by saying that his fundamental assumption that man is a part of nature. And he goes on and says that this means that there's no break in the continuity of nature. Man differs from other things just in a continuum of degrees. Man is simply a little more of the same as other animals. And then on page 48, having built up that whole argument of the continuity of nature, he says, the gift of humanity is precisely that, unlike other animals, we form concepts. Well, now,
Yeah.
at that point, if we alone form concepts,
Right.
and no other animal forms concepts, I'm saying which is true,
Yeah.
then we aren't continuous with the rest of nature. There's a difference in kind there.
Right.
Because the difference in kind is a difference between which, of the two things being
Right.
compared, one does something the other doesn't do at all.
This is really a flat contradiction.
Flat
We
contradiction.
either are different in degree from other animals, or
different
we are
kind.
different in kind from one another.
Yeah.
And you got to choose. You have
That's
to
right.
choose. Having
You-
found the contradiction, you are faced with the task of choosing.
You may not like Mr. Bronowski, but I'm now going to read you from a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, a great scientist. This is George Beadle,
Yeah.
who won the Nobel Prize for genetics and was chancellor of the university, president of the University of Chicago. And here's a book by George, written with Muriel, his wife, called The Language of Life. And this is even more striking because on page 41 we read about Homo sapiens, our ancestor.
Oh, but that's the species
That's
to which we
us.
belong, all right?
He did not differ from, listen to this carefully, because he's using the words even more blatantly. He, Homo sapiens, did not differ from the apes in kind, nor do we, but he differed greatly in degree, as much as our descendants, if the human line survives, may differ from us after an equivalent amount of time has elapsed. That's page 41.
Okay.
On page 39, he says, but with the initial discovery that one can make tools, our species appeared on the evolutionary horizon. Apes can use tools, but only men can fabricate them. I'm not saying it's right, but if it's true that only men can fabricate tools, only men, means apes can't fabricate them, and that means there's a difference in kind, not a difference in degree,
Right.
though 2 pages later he says there's only a difference in degree.
Right.
I really don't, I'm puzzled sometimes. I don't understand how a great scientist like
Well, George Beadle.
George Beadle
Yeah.
can
But-
within 2 pages not know he's contradicted himself.
Are you saying the book's a bad book?
No. I'm saying that even, and true of the great books, true of other books, I could show you a case in Aristotle, I think. Let me give you a case in Aristotle, without even going to the text. In the Politics, and I think Beadle is better than Bronowski, and I think Aristotle is better than Beadle.
Right.
But Aristotle will say in chapter 2 of the first book of the Politics, man is by nature a political animal. And then in chapter 4, he will say, some men are by nature slaves. Well, now, both of those things can't be true.
Right.
For if man, meaning all men, are by nature political, able to participate in government, take part in political life, then some men can't be by nature slaves, incapable of such political activity. See? And yet, contradiction is the most extraordinary thing, because unless you're the most careful writer in the world, you can, as the context of your discussion changes, say things that are not in harmony or coherence. But the duty of the reader, I insist, I may be over-exaggerating this, but my own tendency to be logical.
Well, you
but-
love to find contradictions.
But if you don't find them, what are you doing with your mind when you read a book? If you don't find them, are you really paying attention to the argument? And in the case of Aristotle, I think you either have to find a way of reconciling those two statements, or you have to say he's wrong about one or the other. Either all men are by nature political, in which case no men are by nature slaves, or if some men are by nature slaves, then it's not true that all men are by nature political, you see.
Finding contradictions in a book serves another purpose for the reader. When you find a contradiction, you have found a place where the author is really struggling. If he were clear on a subject, he wouldn't contradict himself.
That's entirely correct.
The contradiction identifies a problem that the author is struggling with and trying to solve. And finding the problems that the author is trying to solve in his book tells you what the book is all about.
And sometimes the author does it for you, and sometimes he doesn't.
You mean, it does what for you?
States what his problem is.
States what his problem is.
But I agree with you that whether he does it or not, your task is to find out what the problem is that the author is trying to solve. Now, Rousseau, whom I've referred to before, does it beautifully for you in the very opening sentence. I mean, it couldn't be better.
Yeah, I love
the
that
opening sentence of The Social Contract. Let me read it to you. He says, these are ringing words, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question I think I can answer. Well, now, you know,
Yeah.
he says, now, the problem this book is going to solve is how, what makes government, the government of men, legitimate. And he says, I think I can answer it. Well, you either find out that he does or doesn't answer it.
Right.
I tend to think he's come very close to answering it, not perfectly, but a very good solution of a very difficult problem.
You have to know what the author was trying to do in order to be able to judge whether he has done it or not.
Right, right.
And this is, of course, the first step in criticism. We are now moving to another phase.
From interpretation to criticism.
Civilization and Its Discontents of Freud is one of my favorite books, and I think it's a great book, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things wrong with it. There is a deep trouble with this book, I think, which I just read, and that is that it depends too much on the analogy between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the history of man taken as a whole and the history of a single individual, the development of a child into a human being. And that's a very perilous analogy to write a whole book on the basis of.
Many authors use that analogy, by the way.
Of course they do. And whenever they do, it can be evocative and useful, but you better not depend too totally and too wholly upon it. What I'm saying here is that it is possible, even in the case of a very, very great book by a very great author, and there's no question that Freud is one of the great ones. I'm saying that that book is still, it may be criticized, may be judged adversely as well as
Favorably.
Favorably, right.
But first, Charles, it seems to me, I would like to say for myself at least, that the rules of criticizing a book are really very important to know. Let me give you one illustration. I do a lot of lecturing as well. I not only write books, but I give lectures. And giving a lecture is like writing a book, and listening to a lecture is exactly like reading
Right.
books. It's a little shorter, a little more compact. And sometimes, when I know the audience, as I know at St. John's College, where I lecture annually, at the beginning of the discussion period, when I expect the students to be critical, and often hypercritical, often aiming to tear me apart.
Oh, they probably are.
I say to them, now look, you've heard a lecture for the first time, you've heard this matter discussed for the first time. Before you start criticizing me, begin by asking the following question. Mr. Adler, do I understand you to say that? And finish it. Now, either I
Do
will
I understand you to say
that, and then
Right.
finish the sentence.
Right.
Now, either I will say, no, that's not what I said, in which case you better let me try again to say what I mean. Only when you have gotten to the point where, having said, do I understand you to say that, I reply by saying, yes, that's exactly what I said, and that's exactly what I mean, are you entitled to go on to criticize? Because understanding what an author or a speaker says is absolutely prior to saying, I disagree with you or I agree with you. It doesn't make any difference whether you say I agree or I disagree. To agree with that which you don't understand is inane, just as much as to disagree with that which you don't understand is impertinent.
Yeah.
So if you want to avoid inanity or impertinence, don't say you agree or disagree until you're sure you understand. Now, of course, the lecturer has a chance. I mean, I can make them ask me the question and say, no, I didn't say that, I didn't mean it. But the poor author is often at the
Well, he's at the mercy of your impoliteness.
That's right.
There are certain rules that we might say of intellectual etiquette that are required for any kind of criticism, aren't they? And one of them is this, that you don't have a right to criticize, to agree or disagree, until you really understand the author. Another one is that you should restrain yourself from being disputatious or contentious.
Criticizing just for the sake of criticizing.
That's right. An awful lot of people do that.
I know.
I think
Many people say, I've heard people say, I don't know what you're talking about, but I think you're wrong.
Right. And finally, the last rule of intellectual etiquette is that you should know the difference between knowledge and just personal opinion.
Yeah.
If you are going to argue with an author, if you're going to disagree with him, you better have reasons other than merely your dislike of what he says or your opinion that it's
In other words,
stupid or something.
When
of the
you
sort.
start to say you're wrong, you've got to give full reasons for saying so. But
Right.
let me add one other thing. An old friend of mine once said, there's no point in winning an argument when you know you're wrong.
Yeah.
A lot of people do try to win
course
arguments
they
when
do.
they know they're wrong. And there may be some point in it practically if money is at stake or position or power. But when understanding is at stake, there's no point in winning the argument when you know you're wrong.
No, because you have definitely lost in
right.
that case. There are 4 respects in which an author can fail to discharge all his obligations
After
to
you
a reader
understand
out there. After you understand him, you have the right to judge him on at least 4 different grounds.
What are they, John?
Well, the first one is that he may be uninformed, and you can, uninformed with respect to some fundamentally important or relevant fact.
Which, if he knew, would change his argument
It
somewhat.
would change his argument, and you can discover that in reading him and charge him with it.
For example, Darwin was, I think, innocently uninformed about the laws of genetics.
Yeah, sure.
The
He couldn't
research-
have known about them. Mendel didn't
researchers of
announce
Mendel
them
came
until
on that
50
track.
years later.
Nevertheless, his lacking information on this score, his not knowing the Mendelian laws of inheritance, is a real defect in the analysis of the origin of species.
Right. And then Aquinas, or Ptolemy, could not have known what Galileo, with his telescope, discovered, namely that the heavenly bodies actually change in all kinds of ways. They thought that heavenly bodies, the stars and so forth, were incorruptible.
Well,
could
they
never
thought,
change.
as a matter of fact, they thought that the heavenly bodies, the bodies above the moon, the stars and the sun, only changed in place, that
That's
they
right.
were subject only to local motion,
Right.
whereas we know they alter in many, many ways. Aristotle made a similar error when in handling animal reproduction. He thought the male, that was the active factor. In fact, he only knew about the semen. He didn't know about the egg. He thought that the woman, or not woman, but the female of the species, whatever the species
Yeah.
was merely the receptacle
Yeah.
for the implantation of the positive male factor. He didn't know that. Lacking a microscope, lacking...
In that case, I think he verges on being misinformed, and that's, I think, the second element, or the second respect in which an author can be wrong and on which he can be criticized. I think Aristotle, if he had looked at women a little bit more sympathetically than he did, would have maybe understood that.
I have to correct you. He isn't dealing with men and women. He's dealing with
All right,
male
well,
and
with-
female of any species.
Okay, but all right. Listen, I'm
Yeah.
not going to argue about Aristotle and women. We could go on
No, we could
about
indeed.
that at some time. Here, an example of misinformation on the part of an author with regard to a truly relevant piece of information. Take, the impact of Freud's works when they first appeared
yes.
on the scene, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. He pointed out that every book that had ever been written about children up to that time
Thought they
was
were
just
innocent.
totally wrong, because they had always assumed that children were totally innocent of any sexual feelings.
Like Wordsworth's trailing clouds of
Oh,
glory
yes,
from heaven's
it's so lovely, isn't it? And yet children, as Freud knew from just looking at them, and as all of us know from looking back into our own childhoods, are very much concerned with sexual matter. And that was an intentional misinformation. I think it's like Aristotle and women.
Yeah. Well, I won't go into that with you, but in general, this is one kind of criticism then. But you aren't entitled to say that you disagree with an author because you think he's uninformed or because you think he's misinformed, unless you can give chapter and verse. Unless you
yes.
can say, uninformed about this thing, and I'll show you what the information is, you
Yes,
see.
you have to be able to provide it yourself.
Now, authors are sometimes make mistakes in logic. Their reasoning is bad or their inferences are poor. Let me give you an example from an author that I admire and that you admire, Machiavelli. This is all contained in a single sentence, as a matter of fact.
I think I admire him more for his verve than for his logic, but anyway, go ahead.
The sentence is, the chief foundations of all states, new as old or composite, are good laws and good arms. And as there cannot be good laws where the state is not well armed, it follows that where they are well armed, they have good laws.
Oh, what a howling non sequitur.
Non sequitur.
Yeah, right.
It does not follow at all that where they are well armed, they have good laws. Now,
Right.
That's an extraordinary statement for a man who's as keen as Machiavelli to make.
Yeah.
Now, there's a fourth point that I would say every book is subject, a criticism that every book is subject to.
Oh, yeah?
Because man is finite, human authors are
all
finite,
right.
and that is, even if an author has made no mistakes of fact, I mean, he's neither misinformed nor uninformed, and if his reasoning is always sound and cogent, never made a slip in logic or a non sequitur, if he's good in all these respects, it is still always possible to say of any author, his analysis is incomplete.
Yeah.
Because to say complete would be to say too much. But again, since you can say it of any author, there's no point in saying it unless you say it very specifically and point out the particular incompleteness you're complaining of. Now let me give you an illustration of this. Both the great Italian poet Dante and the great English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes make the point that peace, civil peace, requires government. That where there is no government, there is no peace, because government is the arbiter that settles disputes by appeals to law and adjudication rather than to force. Yet, Hobbes does not go on and draw the conclusion from that premise that Dante draws. Dante says, therefore, if there's going to be peace in the world, if there's going to be world peace, there must be world government. Hobbes goes on to say that since world government, without even conceiving of world government, since sovereigns stand to one another in a state of anarchy, not in a state of government or law, that war between sovereigns is a continual condition.
The tragedy is that Dante said what he said 400 years before Hobbes said what he said. And Hobbes could have learned it from Dante if he couldn't figure it out himself.
It has often occurred to me that, particularly in discussing the great books, reading them and discussing them, that if every later generation had really read and understood the great works of an earlier generation, many errors, many flaws would have been avoided.
Yes, and
unfortunately, that isn't true.
Good authors require and deserve good readers, but a good reader helps to make good authors if you demand certain things from them.
To go back again to this illustration I used at the beginning of the lecturer and the audience. I wouldn't have enjoyed giving lectures all my life if I hadn't learned from lectures, and I only learned I hate to give a lecture without a discussion afterwards, without a good discussion that is sort of prefaced by this rule of tell me first that you understand me and then tell me what's wrong with what I've said.
Right.
Because when that's done well, I have learned a great deal. In fact, I've almost always, when I'm planning to write a book, given it in lecture form first, in order to get from an audience exactly that kind of criticism. I understand what you're saying, but don't you see that you made an error here? Or don't you think this is incomplete? In that way, I learn from my readers or audience, as I think one can't learn any other way.
Yes, I think it's true. And yet most authors nowadays are not served in that way by professional critics who should be performing that service for them.
As a matter of fact, I think criticism is at a very low level today.
Yeah.
And I think I know the reason why. I mean, when I read reviews of books that have become bestsellers, let me give you 3 examples. The Greening of America, for example, or Future Shock. Take those 2 for a moment. Praised widely. And praised because of the outrageous things they said. Praised because they made claims and made assertions that were extraordinarily violent in ways. Nevertheless,
And they violated the truth, in your view.
But the point is that the critics never said, is it true?
Yeah.
And I find in much of the criticism I read in the current sheets that the critic does not, first of all, ask about of a book, is it true? Is what the author's saying true? Because only after you've said, yes, it's true, does it become significant to say what of it. Raymond Chandler, the little sister. That's a detective story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a story. Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette.
That's a reference book. Put it over there.
I guess you... Okay.
This is Thomas Mann's Death in Venice.
All right, it's a novel. My Life on the Plains, General Custer.
That's biography.
If it's not complete fiction, I'll give it to you, Mortimer.
Very good. And here's a Latin dictionary, which I would take as a reference book.
Yeah, it's a reference book.
Truman Capote. Now, is that fiction or fact?
That's fact.
As much as Custer.
Yes, I guess it is. The works of Thomas Paine, political philosophy.
Indeed.
Abraham Lincoln, collected works of Abraham Lincoln. That's
Political
philosophy. What's that?
Poems and songs of Robert Burns.
Oh, yeah, that goes over here. Now, Gargantua and Pantagruel, that's a novel. That's a novel.
And here's the Los Angeles Blue Book, which is a social register book.
That's a reference book. Right.
Book.
Yeah.
The Arms of Croup, that's kind of social science, very popular social science, isn't it? Current events.
Current events. What we're doing, of course, here is to divide, first of all the fictional works, they're on this side, all the imaginative books on this side, and the expository
ones on this side.
Right.
Ernest Hemingway, The Torrents of Spring is a novel.
Right.
Belongs to The Way of All Flesh is a novel.
Right.
1984.
That's a novel. Yeah.
The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that
that's
goes
not a
along
novel.
No, that's not a novel, that's social psychology.
The Jungle, Upton Sinclair, that's a novel.
That almost is not a novel.
I know it is, you're right.
What would you do with a book which is a textbook in basic conversational French?
I think that's a reference book. Well, maybe, no, listen, that's a practical book. It's a how-to book.
That's a practical book. Very good indeed. 1601. That's
fantasy. That's a novel of Mark Twain.
The Origin of Species, Natural Science.
Natural Science. That's Newton. That's Natural Science.
Natural Science.
There's
that's the great work, Principia Mathematica.
Right.
Philosophia Naturalis, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy.
Here's a volume of Encyclopedia Britannica that goes with a reference.
That's a reference
over here.
Indeed. And here's another book that goes with the reference books. It's a Britannica World Atlas.
Right. That's a reference book.
What would you do with the Essays of Francis? That's philosophical. Would you say the Essays of Francis Bacon?
It's not science. No, that's philosophical, certainly. Here must be another scientific. That's Euclid. That's
that's mathematics.
Okay, but that goes with natural science?
No, I want to make a separate pile of mathematics books.
What do your piles represent here, Mortimer?
Well, they represent 4 or 5 different kinds of expository books. First place, the basic distinction here is between the practical books, the how-to books, the books that tell you how to act or how to do something, how to make something, and the theoretical books. The theoretical books I divided into history and social science and natural science and philosophy and mathematics.
Right. Okay, fine. El Greco. Where does El Greco go? 50 reproductions.
Well, it depends. That's difficult. That's not a.
But that's imaginative in somehow.
I would call that a coffee table book or a non-book.
I'm going to put it among poetry.
Who's Who in America is a reference.
Yeah.
There she goes.
By the way, I've got 3 piles over on this side, on the imaginative literature side. This is fiction, that is stories and novels, and this is poems, and this is plays.
And here's The Rise of American Civilization, which is history.
Sure, history. Ernest Hemingway, short stories of, that's fiction.
And Mara Lindbergh's Gift from the Sea. What would you do with that?
Well, I don't know, Mortimer. I guess it's philosophy, isn't it?
Well,
kind of popular philosophy.
Popular philosophy.
All right. What do we got here? Modern British poetry. That's clearly poems.
Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, it's a novel.
Robbins.
Now, listen, The Imitation of Christ.
That's a theological book.
Where does that belong? With the philosophy?
With the philosophy.
All right. Why does it belong with the philosophy?
Well, philosophy and theology are both non-empirical sciences. I mean,
right.
They are not. They don't proceed by experiment or investigation.
Right.
They're quite different. Theology and philosophy are different, but they are distinguished from the social and the natural sciences.
Right. Okay. The Lives of William Benton. That's a biography. Right.
Robinson Crusoe is fiction.
Well, yeah, I guess it is.
Sure.
Yeah, sure it is. Here's How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren.
That's a how-to book.
What do you got there?
Plato.
Plato.
That's philosophy, clearly.
Well, maybe it's poetry.
No, Charles, this is philosophy.
Okay.
Written in dialogue form, but it's philosophy.
All right. A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, Dr. Johnson. That's autobiography, really.
In this pile here.
Okay.
An actor prepares by the great Russian actor himself, Stanislavski, is a how-to book, isn't
I think so. It belongs with How to Read a Book.
Indeed.
Peck's Bad Boy and His Pa, a compendium of fun, profusely
What do you do with
illustrated.
that?
I think that's stories.
A book of American spirituals
That's
is poetry.
Poetry and song.
Venus Adonis is poetry.
Of Shakespeare.
The Peter Principle? That's low down social science, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Very low
Listen,
down.
I got a big one for you, Mortimer. What? What's this?
Abel Johnson Tasman's Journal. I have to open it and find out. I can't do that without looking at it. Oh, this is a book of discovery. Magnificent book, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's a book of travel and discovery, exploration.
Travel and discovery, so it's like General Custer.
Like General Custer, yes.
Now, a Michelin guide, that's a reference.
Reference book.
What's that?
1974.
That's it. Listen, that's somebody's yearbook in high school.
That's not a reference book. That's a non-book.
Where do we
Put
put
it on
that?
the floor.
Put it back here. I'll put it back
What do
there.
you do? Nicholas and Alexandria is history,
That's-
current history. No,
Well, then
no.
that goes on that side.
That's right.
Mickey Mouse, movie stories. That goes over among the stories. Crime and Punishment among the stories.
The poems of Browning.
Poetry.
French
Los-
Go ahead.
The
Los Angeles Telephone reference book.
Right.
The French Revolution by Thomas Carlyle is history.
Right. What's this? Oil painting, step by step.
That's how-to.
How to.
The Mysterious Universe by Sir James Jeans is natural science.
Okay. The Holy Bible.
That's a special book. I'm going to put that here. That's sui generis. It's a book that stands by itself.
Ernest Hemingway, A Life Story.
That's an autobiography. Or
Well,
biography, rather.
biography, yeah. The Last Days of Pompeii. The history?
That's history. No, by Bulwer Lytton. Oh, no, that's
That's
fiction.
a novel, yes.
But it could have been history.
It could have been.
What now? I've got one for you. What do you do with Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland?
It could be anything. It could be mathematics, or it could
Philosophy.
be fantasy, it could be a fable, but I think it's a novel,
Very
according to this cut that we're doing here.
In this book, Living Off the Country, How to Stay Alive in the Woods,
How to Stay
Oh,
Alive, so that's
in
a
the
how-to
how-to,
book,
yes.
right.
this one, which is the Koran. Oh, that I know. That goes with the Bible. Very special
Interpretations of Life, a survey of contemporary
That's-
by Will and Ariel Durant.
Kind of minor philosophy.
All right. Astrology, that's junk. No, wait a
No,
minute.
no, no.
That's Louis MacNeice.
That's a history of astrology.
Yeah,
that
so
goes
that,
with
that
history.
goes in history. Papillon by Henri Charrière. Now
That's fiction, I think.
well, it's supposed to be an autobiography.
Or let's put it in this.
You want to put it in fiction or
No,
autobiography?
let's put it with history and biography.
Okay. Here's The Emperor Jones, by the way. That's a play, perfectly
The Living
clear.
Sea is a work in biological science.
Yeah, I
isn't it?
think it is, yeah. The Diary of Samuel Pepys, that's autobiography.
Autobiography, indeed.
Collected Poems of Robert Frost, no question. That's
Then
a
we are
poem.
left with two books that are special.
Yeah,
And the reason why they're special, Charles, is they're sacred books. And so they must be read differently from all other books, whether you read them as a believer or not.
right, okay, so that we'll leave
Leave
them
them
there
there.
in, that, in a separate pile.
Now, what we have here then is all the imagined books here divided into three piles. What are your three piles again?
Well, this is fiction here, or stories and novels, and this is poetry, and this is plays.
And then past this line, we have all the expository books which expound knowledge or opinion or are instructional in the sense that tell you how to do things. The instructional books of that character, the practical books, are the books, the how-to books, the books that direct action or tell you how to produce things. And then we have biography and history, the social sciences, the natural sciences, mathematics and philosophy, both speculative and practical. Now, that kind of vision we put into the publication of the great books when we put these color patches on the back of them, because all the books with the gold, the yellowish gold, are books of imaginative literature, poetry and drama and novels and so forth. The books that are with the red on the back are philosophy and theology. The books with the blue on the back are history and the social sciences. And the books with the green tabs are the natural sciences and mathematics and biology.
And then you've got the reference books there,
Right
too.
there.
Yeah. Mortimer, in doing this, we've been classifying books here. We're not doing it just for the fun of it. There's a real purpose in doing this,
Well,
isn't there?
the reason is that, in my judgment, that reading a book involves asking three or four fundamental questions. What is the book as a whole about? How does it say what it says in detail? Is it true? And what of it?
Right.
Now, those are the most general questions you can ask about any book.
And
but
you ask him about every book.
every book,
Yeah.
except perhaps the reference books.
Yeah.
You don't ask that kind of question about
Yeah.
the social register or the telephone book. But all these books,
You might ask, is it true?
yeah, you can assume that. And I don't think you ask it about the non-books, the coffee table books.
Right.
But any serious book, any book worth reading actively for the sake of increasing your understanding or increasing your knowledge requires you to ask these questions. But you can't ask them in the same way of all kinds of books because, for example, let's take the poetry for a moment. Poetic truth is utterly different from scientific truth.
Right.
And if you said, is it true, without knowing the different kind of book you were asking it of, you would be mistaken. Similarly, mathematical
For example, take that book, Papillon,
Yeah.
from which the movie has been made. If you put that on this side of the line, if you put it in the expository books, then you have to ask different kinds of questions about its
Precisely.
truth than if I had been willing to put it in fiction.
And that's why what you did about Custer was significant, too. If you put it in fiction, you wouldn't be concerned with
If you put it in fiction, you don't worry about whether it's true, in a sense. But there is a sense in which a fictional book is true or not true. If it is true to life, true to general experience as we all know it. How do you read a philosophy book, a book of philosophy? What's the, how do you approach it? What's the, could you say just in a sentence or so how you read it?
I think in the case of philosophy, and I'm not sure there's any difference here between philosophy and science, the most important thing to discover in reading the book is the problem the author is trying to solve.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes the author tells you what that is, and sometimes he doesn't. But unless you know what his focal problem is, what his objective is as an analyzer, as a solver of problems, you can't read the book carefully and well.
As far as history is concerned, I would say, particularly current history, I would say that the stance that you bring to it is one of doubt. You read current history with a grain of salt. You ask yourself, what kind of position is this author writing from? Who's he trying to convince? Who is he trying to con, almost, you know? Because an awful lot of current history is written with an aim in mind. And as far as science goes, what would you say?
Well, there, really you proceed with it quite different. After you know what the problem is, you have to see how the evidence has been gathered, how the experiments that have been performed, the phenomena that have been observed, help you to solve the problem. You've got to see how the scientist operates inductively from the evidence to a generalization or an elaborate theory that solves the problem.
Does that mean you have to repeat the experiment?
No, no. If it's described, not as an individual, no.
You don't have to go into the laboratory. No. You can still read Newton without going through the...
Well,
what about mathematics?
Newton describes his experiments for you. In the optics, for example, Newton gives you diagrams and shows you what little experiments performed. Now, mathematics is different again, because there, the thing that you're looking for are demonstrations. You've got to look for the logical rigor of a demonstration.
And so you want to see whether the book is self-consistent, whether it contradicts itself in some way. In the case of a novel, the situation is very different. All imaginative literature, you read with passion, Mortimer. You read with total involvement of your personality, all the way from your head, down to your heart, down to your toes. Everything is involved.
Well, that's exactly the opposite with respect to the books that are expository. There, you read them entirely from the neck up.
Mortimer, there's a famous interchange between Dante and Piccarda in heaven. Dante describes his journey to heaven in the Divine Comedy. And there he meets Piccarda. And as you've often put it to me, he says to her, wouldn't you, she's in a rather low and distant seat in heaven. And he asks her, wouldn't you like to be closer? Wouldn't you be closer to God? And she replies...
More of a front seat.
Yeah, have more of a front seat. And she replies, brother, virtue of charity quiets our will and makes us wish only for what we have and quickens not our thirst for anything else. It is the essence of this blessed existence to hold itself within the divine will, whereby our wills themselves are made one. So that as we are from seat to seat throughout this realm, to all the realm is pleasing, as to the king who inwills us with his will, and his will is our peace.
Would you say that last line in Italian? Can you do it?
E sua volontate nostra pace. And that's probably the most famous line in the Divine Comedy. And his will, that is God's will.
His will is our peace.
Is our peace. Readers over the last 700 years have reacted to that line and to that whole notion with very differing reactions.
that Matthew Arnold said it was the touchstone of poetry.
It was the most beautiful line of all. T.S. Eliot, I think, believes it is the most beautiful single line of poetry. How do you feel about it?
Well, it's always moved me very deeply because, first place, that scene in heaven with all the saints, the souls that are saved, clustering around the vision of God, as it were, but some further away and some nearer. And that question of Donnie's, wouldn't you like to move up and have a better view? Her answer being, no, anywhere here, as long as my will conforms with his, is my delight and my peace. It's one of the most moving scenes in all of literature.
I understand that for many, many years in my life, I agreed with you. I must say that recently I've been concerned. There's something rebellious in me that says I don't want my will to be conformed with anybody's, even God's.
Then you don't belong in heaven.
Perhaps not, Mortimer.
I'm sorry.
Perhaps not, alas.
I'm not sure you belong in hell either, but you don't belong in heaven.
The point, however, is that even to the very greatest of imaginative literature, readers can have differing reactions. And I would imagine that you've had a differing reaction from mine to the two short stories, the two very short stories of Hemingway that I asked you to read.
Yes, in fact, I read them last night.
One of them is The Old Man at the Bridge, a three-page story of utmost simplicity about an old man who is met by the author at a bridge during the Spanish Civil War and is so old that he cannot get away and will certainly be engulfed by the enemy when it shortly comes. How did you feel about that one?
I have to admit that it didn't touch me. The old man, clearly a hopeless case, you're quite right, concerned with these animals that he left behind, and somehow pleased that the cat would take care of itself, though the birds might not.
The birds would. It's the goats.
The goats. That's right. The goats are going to be
the goats, which are obviously going to be
bothered by artillery.
Yeah.
But it's almost not a story. You see, for me, the story is too short. It's a little vignette. You know, I don't know what word to use. It's a little sketch. It isn't fiction the way I like fiction. Nor, as a matter of fact, the other story is a little longer.
The other story is a more famous one, a clean, well-lighted place in which two despairing men come in contact with one another. One man,
two empty lives, two utterly empty lives.
Despairing because he is old and his wife is dead and he has nothing to do except to look forward to death. The other one despairing for reasons which are not described in the story, except that most eloquently stated by him. I mean, his despair, his emptiness, is expressed.
I mean, the older of the two waiters.
The older of the two waiters in his incredible transformation of the Lord's Prayer, you know, in which he says,
I must say
Our nada, who art in nada, nada be thy name, thy kingdom nada, thy will be nada, in nada as it is in nada. Now, the word nada, of course, is the Spanish for nothing.
I have to admit that one passage moved me. Because of its, I'm not sure it moved me for any reason except that it was a kind of a paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer.
But yes, but that's what it is.
I know.
But it's a totally nihilistic paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer, and as such, it is one of the most famous things in modern literature. But neither of these stories really got to you, I think.
Let me see if I can tell you why. The kind of fiction, I'm going to go to the opposite extreme. These are very short stories. I'm going to take a book that is probably one of the longest books ever written. That is Tolstoy's War and Peace. And just as Matthew Arnold uses that line, in his will is our peace, as a touchstone of poetry, I would use War and Peace as the measure of a successful piece of fiction, a great storytelling. And the reason why for me, perhaps War and Peace is one of the greatest books ever written of any kind, is that when I read it, Tolstoy builds for me, creates for me a whole world, a world that he's made, not a real world, but a world that becomes more real for me than any world that I live in. In fact, the last time I read War and Peace was during the summer of the German attack on Stalingrad, when the newspapers were screaming, with screaming headlines told of that assault and that repulse. And yet, actually, I was reading War and Peace, and I was reliving the Battle of Borodino. That was more real for me than the attack on Stalingrad. Now that's when fiction gets me. When it creates a world and puts me in it, and becomes more real than the world in which I live from day to day. No short story can do that for me.
But short stories can do that for me. You see, it takes 1,000 pages for an author to do that to you, I take it, and not every 1,000 pages either.
No,
They have to be
Although I think
good.
that Tom Jones will do that for me.
All right, but you see, that happens to me in 3 pages.
How
And
does it, I don't understand how do you do it?
It is,
How do you do it?
It is because I am willing to let it happen.
You mean I'm not willing to let it happen?
No, you're not. I think
I was
if
quite awake when I read this last night.
you were awake when you read it, but you were not, how shall I say, sensitized to it. You were not ready to be swept up in it within the first paragraph, within the first sentence.
No, I wasn't.
As you have to be when you read a lyric poem. You have to immediately lay yourself open to it. And you have to do that with a short story, too. You are not reading a short story. It's as though you have to get running very quickly and in order to catch up to the short story.
I'm not a sprinter. I'm a mile runner.
Yes, right. And you are resistant
But
to what
how do
the
you
author
do
is
that,
trying
Charles?
to do.
I mean, I don't think I was reluctant. I don't think I was willfully withholding myself from these stories. I read them with an open eye and with a willingness to be pleased, but they left me flat.
Yes, but I think there is a real deep reluctance in you, and it is a reluctance in many, many people to, by the way, few people would agree with you about these Hemingway stories. They are both very successful, famous, much beloved stories. But I think other people have a certain resistance to fiction. They don't like to lay themselves open in that way. They don't, for example, they're disinclined to fall in love with heroines or the heroes if they're ladies or women reading a story. Now, I know perfectly well when I start out a novel, I'm going to fall in love with the heroine. I'm going to be madly in love with her within the first 25 pages. And it generally does happen, and it makes reading a novel for me an enormously
You're a
exciting.
pushover.
I am a pushover. Precisely.
But
I want to be a pushover.
But how do I mean, I fall in love, again, in War and Peace, I fell in love with Natasha.
Yeah. Falling in love with the heroine is only one of the ways in which a reader can participate and should participate in the book that he's reading, a novel, a short story, a poem. For example, a reader can and should share the triumphs and successes of the characters. Tom Jones, for example. I not only fall in love with Sophia Western, his beloved in that book, but I also share Tom's agonies and his successes in his final achievement of all the worldly goods, including Sophia, I must say. In the case of Pride and Prejudice, I'm so delighted that Elizabeth and Darcy get together at the end. I share their happiness and delight. I can share in and delight in the triumph of justice in a novel, and as a matter of fact, a novel is only good if justice is meted out properly. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
And one of the great thing about the Odyssey, which is incidentally, I think, the first Western, because the good guys
Western.
Yeah, the good guys get their desserts, and the bad guys get their desserts at the end of it.
It's Western without cavalry.
Right, without cavalry. Above all, though, you have to let a story work on you. You have to allow it to do everything that it's capable of doing.
Is that an act of will predisposing you to?
I think so. Yes, I think it's a willing suspension of disbelief, as Coleridge called it. You must do it in the theater. You must do it when reading a poem. You must do it when reading a short story or a novel. You must allow the story to do what it can do.
And would you say that the success of fiction, whether it's on the stage or on a page, is that you're unconscious of the fact that you're seeing a play or reading a book?
Yes, I think that's true.
If you're conscious that you're reading or conscious that you're seeing a play, it hasn't worked.
Yes, and of course I can get myself into that position with a story so quickly because I'm highly sensitized to the effort and to the need. For example, I just want to read the end of one wonderful story. It's by John Galsworthy, who is most famous for his Forsyte Saga. But the Forsyte Saga is a potboiler compared to a number of his short stories. And this one is The Apple Tree, a story that you don't know that story. Well, it's a story about a man named Frank Ashurst who comes back with his wife, and he's a middle-aged man, to a certain place out in the country. And he remembers that when he was a young man, he was there as a college student, and he fell in love with a young, simple country girl named Megan. And things happened, as they often do when a sophisticated city fellow meets a simple country girl, and as a matter of fact, he finally betrayed her and went back to his highly sophisticated college and city life. And Megan had been truly in love with him, and therefore she died. she committed suicide or she died of a broken heart. And Frank is sitting there thinking about all of this under the apple tree where Megan is buried. And these words are said at the end by the author. Megan, poor little Megan, coming over the hill, Megan under the old apple tree, waiting and looking, Megan dead with beauty printed on her. A voice said, "Oh, there you are, look." Ashurst rose, took his wife's sketch. She's made a little sketch of the scene, and stared at it in silence. "Is the foreground right, Frank?" "Yes. But there's something wanting, isn't there?" Ashurst nodded. Wanting, he thought. The apple tree, the singing, and the gold. And that's terribly touching.
It is indeed.
Everything
that
is
catches
summed
him.
up.
Yeah.
Everything is summed up in that famous phrase: the apple tree, the singing, and the gold. And his wife will never understand
What he meant by what he said.
What he has lost. It's the kind of story that deeply affects people if they'll allow it to affect them, because it's probably happened to almost everybody. And what you bring to a story is all of your past experience, all of your dreams, all of your illusions, and let the story invade. Mortimer, we've been saying that the most important thing to remember in reading any work of fiction is to involve yourself in it, to open yourself to it, to participate in the life, in the successes, in the problems of the characters. But that doesn't mean, and this is a highly emotional participation, that doesn't mean that your mind stays inactive.
I hope not.
Right? At the same time that you're reading, or after you've read a good novel, it's your obligation as a good reader to criticize it, to judge it as being good or bad.
And to know why it's good or bad.
And to know why it's, you have to give reasons why it's good or bad, right? I think there are two essential questions that you have to ask about a novel, and that is it good in its own terms? Is it good as a fictional work? Is it technically correct? Does it succeed as a book? And secondly, is it true to life? Now,
not true in a scientific sense of true, but poetically true.
Poetically true.
Does it have a verisimilitude? Does it have probability?
Right.
Is it, as Plato used to say, a likely story?
Exactly. That's the perfect way to put it. We read recently George Eliot's Middlemarch.
Yes, I enjoyed that enormously.
And we were very much struck by its verisimilitude, by its... It is a likely story of not only just 2 or 3 people, but of a whole town. It recreates a town.
In the 1830s in England.
Yeah. But we both felt, I think you agreed with me, that the plot was very defective. It was a highly melodramatic 19th century novelistic plot.
You're conscious of a plot if the turning points in it are such sheer coincidences that might not happen.
Right.
That's, by the way, one of my criticisms of many novels, that the story hangs on coincidences.
Yeah, well, it never should.
No.
And every good critic has always pointed that out when it happens. George Eliot, it's curious. She was so marvelously able to create a whole world, and yet she couldn't tell a simple, straightforward story without the plot creaking as she went along. On the other hand, Gone with the Wind has a perfect plot.
Yes.
There couldn't be a more perfect novel, technically speaking, and it made a great movie too. But its verisimilitude, to me, is highly defective. I mean, it's very romantic and sentimental, and its view of the South before the Civil War is largely nonsense.
Yes, yes. I think that's true.
It may be the way we would like it to have been, but it is not the way it was. War and Peace, I think, satisfies both criteria, doesn't it?
For me, it does perfectly.
Yeah.
Perfectly.
It is.
So does Tom Jones, as a matter of
Yes.
fact.
But War and Peace is true to life, even though we didn't live in Russia at the beginning of the 19th.
The plot unfolds the way a stream runs downhill.
And you're never conscious of the plot.
Totally
You're not even conscious of the author's language somehow or other.
That, by the way, is the highest praise you can give any author.
Yes, I think so.
If his writing is so perfect that you're unaware of it.
But at the same time, there's a problem that many readers have with War and Peace, and that is the enormous cast of characters. In the first chapter of War and Peace, about 30 people are introduced to the reader. Their names are strange, they're Russian names.
But Charles, all of us go to cocktail parties. You walk into a large room filled with people with glasses in their hands. You are introduce them quickly. You don't remember their names, but if you stay around long enough, you gradually become acquainted with them. So in a novel like War and Peace, you mustn't be upset by that overwhelming cast of characters at the beginning. You stay around with them. And as you live through that novel, you gradually become acquainted with those characters exactly as you become acquainted with people that you meet in ordinary life.
Or on moving to a new town.
Yes, precisely.
When you first move there, you don't know who your neighbors are, you don't know who's going to be important to you. But as you live there for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years...
They sort themselves out.
They sort themselves out. Well, a good author of a novel can be depended upon
Precisely.
to bring to the fore the people who are important. So I never worry if I don't remember the name of a character at the beginning. I would never stop reading a novel.
Oh, no, that'd be...
because I didn't know who the people were. So one of the things that a good reader does in reading a work of fiction is to judge it critically from these points of view, these 2 points of view. But he also is, I think, required to be able to say in very short compass what the book as a whole is about. That is to state its plot in the simplest terms. Could you state the plot of the Odyssey, for example, in a couple of sentences?
I could, but Aristotle did it better than I can, I think. Let me read you Aristotle's summary in a few sentences of the plot of the whole Odyssey. He says, a certain man is absent from home for many years. He is jealously watched by Poseidon, the god of the sea, and left desolate. Meanwhile, his home is in a wretched plight. Suitors are wasting his substance and plotting against his son. At length, tempest-tossed, he himself arrives and makes certain persons acquainted with him. He attacks the suitors with his own hand and is himself preserved while he destroys them.
That's pretty good, except that it's
too long.
It's too long. It's a little too long. You didn't have to mention Poseidon.
No.
All you'd have to say is that he's away from home. People, in his absence, try to destroy his house. He comes home and single-handed, or with the help of his son, overcomes them and lives happily ever after.
The only thing that leaves out is, it took 9 years to get there.
Yeah.
And one of the great questions in that was how anxious he was to get home.
Yeah.
Did all those adventures really delay him, or did he himself employ delaying tactics in getting home?
And of course, the important thing to remember there is that he was spending those 9 years with a lady named Calypso.
I think the shortest summary of the plot was given for me once by our mutual friend, Clifton Fadiman. He and I were discussing Tom Jones with a class of students, and Fadiman said, plot is very simple. Boy meets girl, boy wants girl, boy gets girl.
Hamlet could be, I think, that the longest play that Shakespeare wrote by far. It's 3 times as long as Macbeth, but it could be summed up very simply in that a father learns that a son learns that his father has been murdered, discovers who the murderer is, fails to kill him in time, and therefore dies himself.
Now that's interesting, because a number of times in which I've read Hamlet with a seminar, great books, I've always asked one question that's almost taken 2 hours for everybody in the class to answer. I say, tell me the story. Mm-hmm. And not just the plot, not summarize the plot, but begin at the beginning and tell the story. And you can never get 20 people to agree about what happens in Hamlet. Mm-hmm. As they tell the story, they're not telling the story simply, but adding their interpretation of motive, interest, thought, and of course people differ about those interpretations.
Yeah. The reason why it's important to be able to state the plot of a novel or a play is because that's the first question that a reader always have to ask. What's it about? Yeah. And that applies to imaginative literature as well as it applies to expository literature.
Let me do it for expository literature. Just as we did it for Tom Jones or Odyssey, I'd say take the whole of Aristotle's Ethics. It's a book about the pursuit of happiness, about the conditions of this pursuit, and how virtue is indispensable for happiness. Yeah. That's the whole book, isn't it?
That's beautiful. That takes a lot of reading and a lot of thinking to be able to
But that's what you must do about a book.
To distill. How long is that book? 300 pages?
300 pages, yes.
Yeah, something like that, into 3 sentences. Now, a novel doesn't always simply entertain us with a story. It sometimes attempts to do other things as well, to teach us something about the world, to promote a certain view of reality or of social and
But
economic conditions.
it must not blatantly instruct.
No, it must not, but it often does instruct, and a good reader of it is docile with respect to it. He allows it to instruct him as well as to entertain him. Gulliver's Travels, for example, is a marvelous story.
It's a great satire, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's a novel. It's a satirical novel or a novelistic satire, but at the same time, it has a view of the way things are and the way things should be that Swift is very clearly trying to tell us.
There, it seems to me, you're much more conscious of the author's thought than you are of the story.
Right.
The story is a vehicle for his expressing his thought. You know, Ibsen was accused of writing problem plays. In our day, there are problem novels. Grapes of Wrath, for example, doesn't move. I mean, I don't like a novel to be a sociological tract or a reformist doctrine. I don't like a novelist to be a social reformer, as I think, in this case, the Grapes of Wrath tried to be.
But when you come to a novel like Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example,
that's a tract.
Harriet Beecher Stowe, that is just a tract.
Yeah.
By the way, it has a great plot. It's melodramatic, but it is a plot that has captured people's attention for 100 years. It's the all-time most favorite play, you know, the play made out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, all-time most favorite play in American history. It had an enormous effect because sometimes books, novels that are written from this point of view with a doctrine embedded in the story, with a preachment, yes, have practical effects. And
no question about it.
President Lincoln said to Mrs. Stowe when he met her, "So you're the little woman that made the Great War," because there was a sense in which the Civil War came about because of the enormous impact of that story on the North. There are other novels that preach in this way. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is a very famous example of this. Sinclair wrote a novel about the packing house industry in Chicago in around 1900, and within the novel was so graphic and so terrible in its description of what was actually done in the slaughterhouses that within 4 or 5 years laws have been passed making illegal what he described. But it's not really a very good story. 1984 is a better story. It clearly has a doctrine. The fearful thing about that is that although we see what Orwell was predicting would happen in only a decade from now, we wonder whether it won't happen whether we know whether we object or not.
Matter of fact, what I just said about War and Peace is interesting because obviously Tolstoy is not satisfied just to tell a story. He does want to instruct us about history and the character of war and peace. But he does it quite consciously and clearly. Those prefaces to the chapters or to the parts of the book are explicitly an attempt to say what he thinks, and then the story resumes itself. And you're never disturbed by that, it seems to me.
Essentially, though, in the long run, what the most important thing a novel must do is to teach you not about exterior reality, about
yourself.
Yes, about yourself. Yes.
And that's why, by the way, that I enjoyed Moby Dick. Not that anything like a whale, but somehow I don't completely identify with Captain Ahab. But that novel makes me look at myself and my own illusions about life as few other stories do.
Oh, it's a profound story. It's a great treatise on whaling.
Yes, that is it.
And it is a great treatise on madness also. But it's much more than that because we don't have to be whalers and we don't have to be mad to recognize that, as you say, Captain Ahab is ourselves, that all of us have got some kind of white whale in our conscious or unconscious in our dreams, and we're seeking it and trying to capture it and kill it.
Avoid being destroyed by it.
And avoid, yeah. You know, Socrates said that an unexamined life is not worth living. I think we're saying here that an unexamined novel, a novel about which you don't think, but just
is not worth reading.
Is not worth reading, that's right. You must involve yourself with it. You must let it work on you, but at the same time, your mind must remain active. You must read it both actively and passionately. Not passively, but passionately.
I think that's a very good point. Charles? Your father once wrote a poem about me. It is called Philosopher at Large, and it is dedicated to Mortimer Adler. And I've read it with great pleasure, and obviously with great gratitude. But it puzzles me, because I'm not sure I understand it. You know, one of my recommendations to any reader to test whether he understands a philosophical book or a historical book, anything, any kind of book, not just poetry, is that he should be able to say in his own words what the author says. And when I try to say in my words, in prose propositions, what this poem says about me, I fail. I don't quite say it. There's something the poem says that I can't say. And that's why I think I don't fully understand it.
Have you ever read it aloud, Mortimer?
I don't think I have.
Well, read it aloud and see how it works.
You know, before I do that, let me say I've done this also with students in reading philosophical books. When they say, I don't understand what Kant says, or I don't understand what Aristotle says, I always say, read the passage out loud for me. Because when I hear them read it out loud, I can hear them not understanding it, the way they read it. Now, maybe I'll show you that I don't understand it by the way I read it.
Maybe
Shall I try?
Yeah.
Here goes. The ancient garden, where most men step daintily, in specimen dust, he bulldozes, plows deep, moves earth, says someone must, if truth is ever to be found, that so long since went underground. What truth? Why down? He shakes his head. He does not know. But roots and rocks go tumbling, tearing, as his blade, shivering from its own shocks, bites further, and upturns pure clay he does not pause to smooth away, and horrifies those men by hedge and dust plot, whom the top sufficed. They thought the garden theirs, and still it is, but the air is spiced with damp new things dug up, or old, he says, like God, like buried gold.
You read it very well, Mortimer. You read it as a poem should be read, with feeling, with understanding. I can't fault your reading, so I don't understand why you don't understand the poem. Remember one thing about a poem. If you're describing the plot of a novel that
Yes.
may be 1,000 pages long, your description of the plot might be 1,000th as long as the novel is. In the case of a poem, a lyric poem, your description of what it says might be longer than the poem itself. But anyway, try it. What does it say?
Well, it says that where others are satisfied with the superficial understanding of what the thought of mankind has been, I dig deeper than they. I bulldoze, I plow deep, and bring up a gold they did not know was buried there. Is that?
How do you read the line, in specimen dust?
I'm glad you asked. Those are the words I don't understand. What does he mean by specimen dust?
Well, that's the key to the poem. And that's,
really?
That's the key
Well, that
word.
may be why I don't understand
And the word is used later on, too. Let me see it.
What does he mean by specimen?
The ancient garden where most men step daintily in specimen dust, he bulldozes. And that's the conflict, that's the striking, shocking thing that my father always thought that you did. It's as though most men consider the past as a kind of museum.
Oh, specimen.
And with specimens in it, specimens of animals or specimens of Greek columns or something like that. And you have the effrontery to go in with your bulldozer, because you have, I mean, when he says, but roots and rocks go tumbling, tearing as his blade, shivering from its own shocks, bites farther. And my father was thinking of a bulldozer tearing through a garden, tearing through a museum.
Museum, I hadn't thought about that.
And that's a terrible thing for a man to do. But it is what he always thought you did. He admired you enormously for it, but he understood why other men, viewing the past of philosophy as a kind of museum, were shocked by what you did.
That's very extraordinary, because those were the words, as I read that I didn't understand.
I thought they might be. I'll read you another poem.
Please.
Which you know very well, which everybody knows very well, which every English child learns by heart in school, as a matter of fact, and yet which I think 99% of all readers misunderstand. It's the poem by Wordsworth, composed upon Westminster Bridge.
One of my favorite sonnets.
September 3, 1802. He's looking at the city of London. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. And that's a lovely poem. What does it say? What is the profound irony in it, Mortimer?
That this city, this great city that Wordsworth loves and expresses his love for in the first 12 lines, no,
I don't think he does express his love for this city. I think he expresses his hatred and abomination of this city in the first 12 lines, and that's what the irony of the poem is.
Well, where do you find hatred and abomination? I can't find it at all.
The city is beautiful, Mortimer, because it's asleep. The city, which is an abomination upon the countryside, with its smoke that fills the air, with its noise, its turmoil, its chaos that disturbs the nature that it has invaded.
But in the early morning, when it's not alive, not awake.
When it's not itself, it is beautiful.
Oh, I see.
Because it reminds the poet of what this valley of the Thames would look like if the city were not there.
I'm sorry to say that though I've read that poem many, many times and enjoyed it, I've never understood it before.
But isn't that true? Isn't
Absolutely
it clearly
yes.
true that that's what he is saying?
Also, it's true in terms of what one knows about Wordsworth.
Exactly, exactly.
But I...
The poet of nature could not have written a poem
if I
about
had asked
London.
myself that question, I would have caught it, I think. No, I think that's extraordinarily good. Not all lyric poetry has a hidden meaning of this kind. Let me interrupt you for a moment to say one of my favorite poems by Wordsworth, I'm going to read it to you for a moment, I think it's perfectly clear, and I understand it's all on the surface. There's no hidden meaning here. Every child knows this poem. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. That seems perfectly clear to me.
Yeah, I think it's too clear.
Oh, is that why it's not a great poem?
I think it's a homily, and homilies are fundamentally not very
Now, are you
poems.
saying that a great lyric poem requires depth that this doesn't have?
Yes. It's a superficial poem, Mortimer, and a superficial poem is not the best kind.
You know, would you say that, I think I read philosophical books and scientific books, even mathematical books, with great attention to every word and to what lies between the lines as well as what's on the lines. And yet I suppose I don't read lyrics that way.
No, you probably don't. You probably, when you read a philosophical book, you look for the key words. And in a poem, it is also necessary to look for the key word and to understand often a poem, the meaning of a poem hangs on a single word. I'll give you another example of a poem that you not only know, but like very much, and this is Shakespeare's famous sonnet 116.
Yes.
It starts out, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments.
Love is not love that alters when it alteration finds.
Exactly, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark, and so forth and so on. Now, let me ask you a question about this poem. Just in that first sentence, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. What's the meaning of the word admits?
Allow.
Allow in a logical sense. Let me not concede that there are
Any
impediments,
impediments
right?
to the marriage of two minds.
But there's another meaning of admit, isn't there?
Admit? Concede?
No? Well, no, that's, again, the logical meaning.
I admit you to my room.
Yes, but that's a physical action.
Yeah.
Let me not to the marriage of true minds. Let people come in to stand between us. And then there's a quite different meaning of admit.
But tell me, though, how does the second sentence follow the first? Why does, having said, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, why does the poet go on to say, love is not love that alters when it alteration finds?
Well, that's the point, you see. There are impediments to any marriage of true minds, or indeed to any love. They come into it, and these are physical people or events or circumstances that come in. It's not purely a logical concession or admission, but people come in and interrupt a great love. And therefore, he goes on to say, if love changes, when that kind of change occurs, it's not truly love.
I see.
Now, if you haven't caught that double meaning of the word admits, you have lost the meaning. I'll give you one more example, and here is another poem. I think it is probably the most beloved of all American poems. The poem that's best known to young people in this country. It's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Those were my father's favorite lines in Olive Frost. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now there is just as profound irony or ambiguity or problem in this poem as there is in the Wordsworth one. Yeah, and the way to identify it is to say, what is the difference between the poet's desire and his message in this poem? His message is, pretty clearly, that I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. I must get on and go on with the business of life and so forth. But what is his desire as expressed in the poem?
To stay in the woods?
Yes, but what does the word sleep mean?
I don't know.
I think to die. Sleep means two things. It has meant two things for poets for 2,500 years. It means both the sleep from which you awake and the sleep from which you do not awake, that is death. And Frost wrote this poem in a period of a very great unhappiness and almost despair. And this poem that is sentimentally viewed as a kind of paean to life and an invitation to life has truly and genuinely at its heart this frightful vision of the attraction of death. Of course, what we're emphasizing here in what we're saying about this Frost poem is the necessity of reading a poem over and over again, out loud, and then to yourself, and then out loud once more, because you must find that key word on which the meaning of the poem hangs. And in the case of Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, I'm sure it's the last word. We've been saying that in reading a lyric poem, one of the things you have to look for is the key word, a single word on which perhaps all of the meaning of the poem hangs. The most famous poem probably of William Butler Yeats is called Sailing to Byzantium. And here the key word is not the last word or in the last stanza. It comes right at the beginning, and if you miss it and go over it too fast, you have missed the meaning of the poem. It starts out by saying, that is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, and so forth and so on. And then he goes on to say, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. And then he says, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Now, the key word in that poem is that.
Why?
The very first word in the poem. Where is that? That is no country for old men.
Well, I would suppose Byzantium.
No, that's Ireland.
How would I know that?
Well, you've got to read carefully. That
I don't
is no country.
I don't see anything in the text that would help me with
That is no country for old men, where the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations. And therefore, because that is no country for old men, I, an old man, have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. But
Do not challenge your analysis or your interpretation. I only wonder how one would come by it by normal steps.
the normal steps would be this. You would read it not knowing, thinking that that was Byzantium, and you would continue to be puzzled by the poem. And you would begin to recognize that the structure of the poem requires a description of two places, that and this. And then you would ask yourself, where is that? And you look back and see, it's the first word. Sometimes the key word is not a word at all, but a whole line. And in a famous poem of Robert Frost's, this line has become very famous. It's called Mowing. There was never a sound beside the wood but one, and that was my long scythe whispering to the ground. What was it whispered? I knew not well myself. Perhaps it was something about the heat of the sun, something perhaps about the lack of sound, and that was why it whispered and did not speak. It was no dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak to the earnest love that laid the swale in rows, not without feeble-pointed spikes of flowers, pale orchises, and scared a bright green snake. The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows.
Read that again now.
The fact.
F-A-C-T?
The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows, my long scythe whispered and left the hay to make. Now that line, the fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows, has become very celebrated because it is the heart and soul of this poem. You know what it means?
No. No, I don't.
But
the fact is
the sweetest dream that labor knows. One reason why it so clearly is important is because if you analyze it, examine it very carefully, all of the words in it and the grammatical constructions in it don't make any sense.
No, they don't.
A fact is not a dream. Labor doesn't know anything. Labor doesn't know a dream, which is in turn a fact, and so forth and so on.
Hence?
And yet there is a meaning to the statement, isn't there?
Well,
With regard
I
to
don't
labor,
doubt it, but I don't know what it is.
with regard to labor, when you're working, the most satisfying thing about work is the work that you do. It is not the work that you have done. It is not the work that you anticipate doing, but labor has this curious quality about it that as you are working, the work itself is the satisfying thing about work. It's just it's the grass cut down. It's
That's
the
a strange use
swale
of the
of
word
grass.
fact. you
Yes,
say.
it is. It's very strange, and its very strangeness is what brings the line to your
Surely,
attention.
surely. But I would never have understood it without this discussion. I
But
don't
if
think.
you go on to read Frost very carefully, you find that many of his poems he's making this same point. Don't trouble me too much with rational considerations.
Charles, this little discussion we're having reminds me of a lecture I once gave many years ago, shortly after How to Read a Book was first published, which I said that I thought that solitary reading was almost as much a vice as solitary drinking, and this convinces me. If I read that poem by myself, I think I'd have given up. But this short discussion has carried me forward. And I think it's equally true of philosophy or anything else.
Yeah.
Reading books with other people, or having two people read the same thing and discussing it, heightens the reading many, many times. I really think solitary reading is not nearly as effective as communal reading.
It's true. I'm sure you're right. Nevertheless, there are many times when you have to read alone.
By yourself.
And you don't have
At least
anybody
once.
to share your reading with. But the point is that you've got to read terribly actively. You've got to seek for meaning,
Oh, sure.
even if you don't see it at first. And it's as though you join in a dialogue with yourself. You look in the poem for the key word, for the key line. You, as it were, fill in the blanks in the
I
poem.
suppose, taking that poem, if one started by asking the question, what can this line possibly mean? That question would get one to first base.
Exactly. That's the point. And you do something for the poem that the poem, on the surface at least, doesn't do for you.
Correct.
You have to put yourself into it. The same thing applies, I think, most truly to drama. You cannot read a poem, a play. The best way to experience a play is to see it. But many times you read a play, and you have to put something of
You have
yourself
to supply
into
your
that
own
too.
stage directions and
Yeah.
your own direction, as a matter of
Right.
fact, don't you?
Well, I'll show you. I've got a stage up here. This will be probably the only chance I'll ever have in my life to direct Hamlet, and I'm going to take it. I've got characters here. I'll call this the king. That's Hamlet's father, or his stepfather. the man who Hamlet has just discovered from the ghost of his own father has killed his father. This is Polonius, the prime minister, and not only the prime minister, but the father of Ophelia. Here's Hamlet. Polonius has been telling the king, he's been trying to explain why Hamlet has been acting so strangely, and he has been acting strangely. The audience knows this is because Hamlet has just seen the ghost, right? But, of course, the king doesn't know that yet. Polonius assumes that Hamlet is acting so crazily because he's in love with Ophelia, and he explains to the king about this. And the king is a little dubious and a little suspicious. So Polonius says to the king, well, you know, Hamlet walks in these galleries from time to time, and when he comes sometime, I'm going to loose my daughter to him. Now, that's a very striking phrase. And according to the old stage direction in the Elizabethan version of Hamlet, Hamlet does not enter until several lines later. But I believe, I take this idea from Dover Wilson, who wrote a book called What Happens in Hamlet, that Hamlet must have heard that earlier. And he must have been walking, say he's walking in this gallery up here. The audience doesn't see him for the moment, but Polonius is talking to the king, and Hamlet must come out here and suddenly start and notice what's going on, and then hear Polonius say, and I will loose my daughter to him, which he takes in a sexual as well as a social sense. He ducks back because the king may turn, and then the king is sent behind the arras over here by Polonius, and Hamlet comes out, and they meet. And
the king is sent. The king is sent there by Polonius.
By Polonius,
in order to overhear the conversation.
In order to overhear the conversation, and we can read that conversation.
Let's do that.
And you'll understand why it is so important, even though the old stage direction didn't say it, for Hamlet to have overheard those previous words. Enter Hamlet reading.
Oh, give me leave. How does my good lord Hamlet?
Well, God a mercy.
Do you know me, my lord?
Excellent well. You are a fishmonger.
Not I, my lord.
Then I would you were so honest a man.
Honest, my lord?
Aye, sir, to be honest as this world goes is to be one man picked out of 10,000.
That's very true, my lord.
For if the sun breed maggots in a dead dog, being a god-kissing carrion, have you a daughter?
I have, my lord.
Let her not walk of the sun. Conception is a blessing, but not as your daughter may conceive. Friend, look to it. And then the scene, of course, goes on, and there's wonderful things that happen in it. But the things that Hamlet says to Polonius are inexplicable unless he has overheard that previous remark. When he says, for example, let her not walk to the sun, the word is spelled S-U-N in the old versions, but this was a common Elizabethan pun. Sun's spelled S-U-N and S-O-N.
Yeah.
And that is to say, let her not get too close to the sun, who is me, because I am the son of the king. Conception is a blessing, but not as your daughter may conceive. If you loose her to me, she may conceive out of wedlock, you see. And when he refers to, when he says this thing to Polonius, I take you for a fishmonger. I know you're a fishmonger. Whoremonger is the word that would have been in everybody in the Elizabethan audience's mind. Now, that sort of little thing, I think, is always necessary to do whenever there's any kind of puzzlement in a play of Shakespeare or anybody else.
Staging it.
You must stage it, and if you had a stage like this, it would help a great deal.
You can do it in your imagination. You don't have to have it as elaborate as this.
I'll do another one now. The end of King Lear has always been rather puzzling to people. King Lear is dead. Can you see his name there? Yeah, that's King Lear. He's lying there. I'll take this sign that means this is the king and make him the Duke of Albany. The Duke of Albany is standing here. And this is Kent, the old servitor of King Lear, and this is Edgar, who is the son of the Duke of Gloucester. King Lear is dead, Cordelia is dead, the story is over, but there's a little wind-up. And Kent says, Albany first says, he's the inheritor of the whole thing, you see, he's the son-in-law and so forth, he's the, he says, we're going to have to rule this kingdom from now on. Kent says, I have a journey, sir, shortly to go. My master calls me. I must not say no. Now, his master is
dead.
King Lear, but he's dead. And so he is saying, he is calling me to death. I'm an old man, and I have no more career ahead of me. Albany then, in the last words of the play, says, "The weight of this sad time we must obey, speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest hath borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." Now, who's the oldest?
Lear.
No, it's not Lear. Lear is dead.
Oh.
It's Kent.
Kent, yes.
It's clearly Kent. Now, but most audiences miss that, and many directors miss it. So Albany would be required to point in some way toward Kent, or make a gesture toward him, and the oldest, or nod toward him, or bow toward him when he says this. If you don't do that, the play ends in a kind of confusion.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing is what I have in mind when I say that you should direct the play. I like to think that the director's role, in the case of a play, is the general role of the reader in reading any work of this kind.
But it sometimes takes great skill. For example, in reading the Greek tragedies, where there are almost no stage directions at all, just enter and exit, it is very hard to often imagine exactly how the characters, the leading characters, confront one another.
Well, that's true, but nobody ever said that reading was easy. No. Reading is very hard. If it weren't hard, it wouldn't be worth doing.
Correct.
And the better the work that you're reading, the harder the work is, and therefore the more satisfying the result.
Recently, I read a book by Josephine Tay called The Daughter of Time.
Oh, yeah.
It's a novel. In fact, it's a detective story, and I read it as a detective story for pleasure. And then suddenly my mind was caught in a problem I never thought about before.
Yeah, I know.
The book presents a totally different theory about one of the great English kings, Richard III, than the one I was acquainted with from reading Shakespeare's play, Richard III, or reading the ordinary history books about Richard III, which make him out to be a villain.
Yeah.
Really quite a villain.
The Crookback, Richard Crookback.
That's right.
With his hunchback and his villainous...
Even questionable whether he had a hunchback. And it's certainly, according to Josephine Tay, highly questionable whether he murdered the two princes who might have been heirs to the throne in the Tower. In fact, she amasses a great deal of evidence and very cogent arguments to show that it was not Richard III, but the first Tudor king, Henry VII, his rival in a sense, the man who made him abdicate or killed him, led to his assassination. Well, after all, I can't take Josephine Tay as a serious historian, and so what I would do is to read books on both sides of this question, look at the evidence amassed pro and con, and I would be in the best position to make my own mind up. Everyone has to make his own mind up on a question of this kind as to whether or not Richard III is the hunchback villain or the good king.
Right, and this would be a different kind of reading from any kind of reading we've been talking about
Absolutely.
before.
Because it's, you know, at the time that How to Read a Book was first published, some wag wanted you to take the book off, wrote a book called How to Read Two Books. But that, in effect, that title, which was meant jocularly, is really quite serious, because the art of reading not just two books, but two or more books, a whole set of books on a given subject, is perhaps the highest reach of the whole business of reading.
You know, this is really fascinating, Mortimer, because you started out to spend an hour reading a detective story just for pleasure, and you find yourself undertaking the highest and most challenging level and kind of reading that there is, syntopical reading, as we call it, where you read many books on one subject in order to understand, to discover whether they agree or disagree.
At the Institute of Philosophical Research, for example, we produced, with a large staff of persons engaged in the work, these 2 volumes on the idea of freedom. That staff, men, women, read over 500 books about freedom, trying to discover whether the same subject is being discussed by all these books. In fact, they discovered there were 5 different subjects to which the word freedom was applied. And then for each of those subjects which they identified, they tried to find out whether the authors who wrote about that subject under the name of freedom agreed or disagreed, and why they disagreed, how they argued about the subject. And these 2 volumes are a kind of map, a kind of chart of the whole terrain of the controversy about freedom. This is a fine example of syntopical reading, and this book that you did also.
That's another one.
On the idea of progress, same method. You read a whole series of books, all dealing with the subject of progress, to find out what the range of opinion is. The lines, the patterns of agreement or disagreement, differences of opinion, and whether or not they all focus on one and the same subject or on several subjects.
Right.
It's a very engaging and exciting undertaking, but elaborate, almost always elaborate.
I was just considering the last item in this book, The Idea of Progress, is a 15-page bibliography. That's the last thing in the book and the last thing I wrote, but the first thing you do. Yeah. That's the first step that you take, is to gather the material.
Bibliography and The Idea of Freedom is 50 pages long.
Right, right.
Huge bibliography.
And then after you've decided or have a rough idea what the materials are, then you inspect them. You look at them very quickly. You don't read them right all the way through.
And you have to find the passages in different books that speak to the same point. Sort of, you do a kind of assembly of relevant passages,
right,
and relate them to a given point of reference.
Exactly. And then you have to come to terms, not with each individual book, but with the common terms in the whole discussion.
You discovered in looking at the whole literature on progress that some authors think that progress consists of going from less to more, as progress of population increases.
Right.
And some authors think that progress consists of going from worse to better.
Right.
Well, now, those are two different meanings of progress.
Right.
And if one author thinks that progress is quantitative, and the other thinks it's qualitative or ameliorative in the sense of worse to better,
yeah,
they're talking about different meanings, different things.
That's right. And then from then on, you have to read all of the authors that you've assembled here according to those common terms.
But even after you've done that, after you've found that a number of authors are talking about the same object, that they're using the crucial word applied to the same point of reference, the same object, it then becomes, I think the most difficult step is to find out whether they agree or disagree, because they all use the language in their own way. And when you find that they disagree, you've got to find out, if you can, their reasons for disagreeing.
Right.
Let me give you an illustration of a very narrow case of syntopical reading that I've had some experience with. I'm going to take three authors on a subject. The subject is freedom. I mean, I'm going to, in other words, condense these two volumes into one simple illustration. I'm going to start out with an author a very interesting one, Jonathan Boucher, who was an Anglican divine, Anglican clergyman in 1775, who made a speech from a pulpit in Virginia, arguing that, of course, that the colony should not resist the rule of George III. In the course of this...
He had to have his pistols up on the pulpit.
That is correct.
He was afraid of what his parishioners would do to him.
In the course of this sermon, he defines liberty. He says, "True liberty, then, is a liberty to do everything that is right, and being restrained from doing anything that is wrong. So far from having a right to do everything that we please under a notion of liberty, liberty itself is limited and confined, but limited and confined only by laws which are at the same time both its foundation and its support." Okay. Now there's a meaning of liberty which says liberty consists in obeying the law.
Yeah, I understand it. I may not like it, but I understand it.
That's
right.
Now, you then let's turn for a moment to John Stuart Mill, who wrote the great essay on liberty in the 19th century. And here we have a different conception of liberty. And we find early in the essay this statement about freedom. "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it." And then later in the essay, he makes another statement which I want to read to you. "Whenever, in short, there is a definite damage or a definite risk of damage either to an individual or to the public, the case is taken out of the province of liberty and placed in that of morality or law." Now notice, what he's saying is the very opposite of Boucher. Boucher's saying liberty consists in conformity to the law, obedience to the law, doing what the law commands. Right. And he's saying the province of liberty is the province of those actions not regulated by the law. Right. When an action conforms to the law, when you're compelled to do what the law commands because of the risk of damage or injury to others, then it's not free action. Right. The very opposite. Freedom consists in being outside the sphere of law, whereas Boucher says freedom consists in acting within the sphere of law. Right. Now, you got those two opposites.
Yeah.
Now, let me give you a third case. John Locke, in the essay on second treatise on civil government, I'll warn you in advance, I'm going to ask you whether Locke agrees with Boucher or agrees with Mill or holds a position somehow in between them. Locke says, "Freedom is not a liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. But a freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where that rule prescribes not to be subject to the inconstant uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. And just to be sure you've got the full text, let me read you one other passage. For in all the states of created beings, capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law, and is not, as we are told, a liberty for every man to do what he lists. Now, does Locke agree with Boucher, or does he agree with Mill?
I think he agrees with both of them. Where there's a law, he agrees with Boucher, freedom consists in obeying the law. Where there is no law, where it does not apply, then a man is free to do as he chooses and wishes.
That's, I think, correct.
Yeah.
But what a complex pattern that is, but not nearly as complex as if you brought more and more authors in and saw all the ramifications on the idea of freedom.
Yeah, it's a...
But I think it's a fascinating pursuit to discover how men's opinions are related in a complex pattern of agreements and disagreements, partial agreements and partial disagreements on a given subject. And the only way you can find that out is by doing this kind of reading.
Mortimer, we should say a word about this term that we use to describe this high, challenging level of reading, syntopical reading.
It comes from the book Syntopicon,
Right.
which exists here in 2 volumes. It was called the Syntopicon, and we call it an index of the great ideas in the great books. The word Syntopicon, of course, is a made-up word. It means a collection of topics. But let me tell you why we created this Syntopicon in the first place. When we decided to publish the great books, we thought that people would be helped to read them if they could find out what the great authors from Homer down to Freud had to say on particular subjects. That is, not just read them for pleasure, but read them to understand the pattern of differences of opinion, the agreements and disagreements among the great minds of the whole Western tradition.
Great conversation between all the authors.
Now, a conversation consists when you and I talk about the same topic. If we're talking about different topics, we're not conversing.
Right.
So we divided these things into 102 ideas and some 3,000 topics. On each of these 3,000 topics, we put down the great conversation by citing the passages in the great books which discuss that topic. Let me give you an illustration.
Are they really talking to each other?
No.
Is Aristotle really talking to...
In fact, that's what's wonderful about it. It's a kind of tour de force. It's acting as if all the great authors were assembled in one room together. We said to you, now, gentlemen and ladies, what do you think about divorce? Or what do you think about capital punishment? Or what do you think about the equality of men and women? I'm going to give you that example. Imagine now, everyone, including the writers of the Old and the New Testament, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Shakespeare, Freud, John Stuart Mill, Locke, Hobbes. And here, one of the 3,000 topics is the differences between men and women, their equality or inequality. Now, if you were to read, take you hours to do it, of course, all the passages cited here, the remarkable thing you'd find, and I say this because I don't think most women libbers know this, only 2 voices in the whole tradition of Western thought speak out for the equality of men and women. Plato, in the 5th century BC, says that they're completely equal and that all political offices should be equally open to both. And John Stuart Mill, 2,000 years later almost, in 1863, in a book called The Subjection of Women, again speaks out for their political and economic equality. And in between Plato and Mill, no one at all. All the opposite. Women are inferior. Women should be subjected.
Well, I don't think Dante would say that women are inferior.
You'll be surprised to find that Dante isn't quoted here.
Well, he doesn't make an explicit statement in the Divine Comedy, but
right.
Clearly the exaltation of Beatrice...
Women are superior.
Women are superior.
Not equal.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, I think they're all crazy because men and women are equal. They're not, neither one is superior to the other or inferior to the other in general.
You're taking sides.
Well, I think you always must, you know. A syntopical, an exercise in syntopical reading doesn't stop with the analysis of the discussion. You can lay it all out there and find out that author A says this and author B says that.
But you should do that before you do decide.
Oh, yeah. But eventually, you've got to make your own decision about it.
Obviously so.
And not only make a decision, but you've got to act on the basis of your decision.
How do you decide here?
Oh, in the case of Josephine Tay, I decided long ago that Richard III was not an evil king, that he was one of the best kings that England ever had, and that he did not kill those 2 little princes in the tower.
All I can say, Charles, is that I will let you know whether I agree with you after I've done my syntopsis.
You know, Mortimer, it's an appalling fact, but last year in the United States alone, something like 35,000 to 40,000 separate titles were published. Now, what does a reader who wants to read well and truly and actively do with that enormous mass of reading matter?
And what does he do with the 8 million books on the shelves of the Harvard Library?
Yeah.
In fact, not only can he not read them all, he shouldn't read them all. Thomas Hobbes once said, "If I read as many books as most men do, I would be as dull-witted as they are."
Well, how many books can you read in a lifetime? I mean, read in the sense of read that we've been talking about here.
I would think in a lifetime considerably less than 500. Might even be as little as 200 or 300 books in a lifetime. Read well, read actively, read for the purpose of deepening one's understanding and lifting one's mind up to a higher level of insight and understanding.
Well, you've read more books than that, though, of course. You've read books at various levels of activity and intensity.
Well, as a matter of fact, I like to think of all the books in the world as forming a vast pyramid. At the baseline of that pyramid are the books that one doesn't have to read even once. One could scan them and put them aside. They are not, except perhaps for pleasure or to pass an idle hour, not worth reading once.
And what's the percentage? What percentage?
I would say that's
95%?
95%.
Yeah.
Above the baseline is a second level of the pyramid, are the books that are good enough, and there are good books, but not great books, good books, good enough to read carefully just once. But if you went back to them, you'd find no reward in them at all. They wouldn't hold up. They would not lift your mind any further. They wouldn't reward you.
You would have gotten everything out of them the first time
reading
that they had to offer. Yeah.
At a level higher than that, a much smaller number of books, I would say now 2% of all the books that are written are worth reading more than once, 2 or 3 times perhaps. A second time, you would find other facets that you hadn't seen the first time.
And you would want to check your insights into the book the first time.
But perhaps not more than 2 or 3 times. And then, at the very apex of the pyramid, are the very small number of books, I would guess 100 or less, that would be worth, that are inexhaustible, in the sense that you could read them over and over and over again, any number of times in the course of one's life, always learning more.
Well, why is that? I mean, that's a strange thing to say, isn't it? That you can read a book over and over and over again without exhausting it. What is it what characteristic of the book allows that?
What I often have said about a great book is what makes that to be true, namely, that the book is over everybody's head all of the time.
Yeah.
So that it has enough power, so no matter how often you come at it, there's more there to attract your mind and inform your mind. There are very few books like this. You know, there are many definitions of the great books. Mark Twain once said wittily, the great books are the books that everybody wants to have read, but no one wants to read. And your uncle, Carl Van Doren, once said in my presence, I thought very, very wisely, that the great books are the books that never have to be written again. They're so good, no one can try to do them again. But I do think that my definition goes along with your uncle's, that the great books are the inexhaustible books, the books that sustain a lifetime of reading.
And of course, when you go back to them, you have changed, you've grown up, you've matured.
Precisely.
Your mind has become more elevated, you hope, and if you are a good reader, that's likely to have happened. And even so, that book is still over your reach just a little bit. And it continues to be just out of your reach. You can reach the lower part of it, but it still will pull you up and forward in life.
But since human beings are different, I would guess that the great books, the books that will do this for you, may not be the books that will do it for me.
No, I'm sure
Perhaps
that's
for
true.
every individual, there's a small set of books that act in this magnetic way, in this powerful way of keeping the mind growing, alive and growing. And one way to test this out, I've done this with people over the years, always with amusing and instructive results, is to imagine the experiment of having to live on a desert island. This is a desert island beautifully outfitted. You're not Robinson Crusoe having to take care of yourself. The hotel arrangements are excellent. Your food and shelter, all the conveniences of life. There are only 2 things that you're going to lack on this desert island. You don't have to work for a living. All your time is your own. You have no human beings to associate with. You lack company.
Oh, yeah, that's
and you will have
terrible.
no radio and TV. And you have I'm going to put you on this desert island, put myself on this desert island for 10 years.
So during those 10 years, you have to occupy your mind by reading. It's the only...
You have to keep your body exercised. You have to keep, if you don't swim or run or climb trees, your body will become flaccid. You'll lose your muscle tone. In fact, you probably won't be vigorous and well.
Right.
And similarly, if you don't use your mind in that time, your mind will go to pieces. So you
Right.
have, now, the only thing you're going to be allowed to take on the desert island with you is 10 books. And the question is, if you had to sustain your mind, the food is supplied. It's going to sustain your body. If you had to sustain your mind for 10 years, what 10 books or 10 authors, 10 sets of writings would you take with you?
Or which ones would you take?
Let me show you. Here are the great books of the Western world, and there are 74 authors here. And I can't take them all. In fact, I wouldn't want to take them all, because only a small number of these are the greatest of the great books. Let me tell you which ones I'd take. First of all, I'd take Thucydides,
Oh, really?
History of the Peloponnesian War.
Oh, you surprised me.
And I would take that because that history, that story of the conflict between Athens and Sparta, holds the mirror up to all international relations, the whole world of politics, both in speech and action. I would then take not all of Aristotle, but just 2 of Aristotle's works in this volume, his Ethics and his Politics, which deal with the perennial and absorbing problems of the good life and the good society.
I expected that one, Mortimer.
I would take also Plato, because the dialogues of Plato are, I think, difficult to understand, but always rewarding when one tries to understand them. They are a mixture of poetry and philosophy,
Yeah.
and belong in my list
Now,
of 10.
that surprises me a little bit. I didn't think Plato would be among your 10.
Next, I would take the author that Harry Truman read over and over and over again, and I read it over and over again, just like President Truman. Plutarch's Lives.
Yes, I agree
Because
completely.
you agree to that?
I agree completely. That's,
Read it over.
I'll tell you in advance, that's one of my 10
Good.
also.
Now, my next 2 you probably won't take, but I would take Augustine, the father of Christian theology, Christian belief, and I take it because of one work in this volume, that is his Confessions.
Yeah.
Because the Confessions are the account of a man, an extraordinary man, powerful man, seeking his salvation and dealing with all the questions involved in the salvation of the human soul.
I think that if I had 11 or 12 or 13 to take, I would have included Augustine, but I didn't.
Along with Augustine, I take another great Christian theologian, and that is Aquinas, the Summa Theologica, but not the whole Summa Theologica. I want only the treatise on God and the treatise on man.
You can have the whole volume if you want to.
Now then, I have here the Essays of Montaigne.
You chose Montaigne?
I did indeed.
Oh, I'm delighted, Mortimer. That's almost my favorite book.
Because this is a commentary on every aspect of human life, on the
Right.
frailties of human nature,
Right.
on the foibles of man, and written with magnificent wit, magnificent
And you know, I like
variety.
Montaigne, too. I've thought in choosing my 10, which I'll show you in a moment, that I would have to live with these people for 10
Well, you
years,
are.
and I'd like
That's
to
right.
live with Montaigne.
Then I would take, of course, along with Montaigne, I would take the plays of Shakespeare. There I'll give nothing up. I want all the plays of Shakespeare.
And the poems,
And
right?
the poems.
Right.
That's 8.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
8.
right.
Now, my next 2 are an English philosopher, John Locke.
You're taking Locke, huh?
Both for his, not that I agree with him, but his thought fascinates me.
Yeah.
And the more I look at it, the more questions arise. Not that I agree with his conclusions, but they put to me the questions I want to think about. Both his treatise on civil government and his essay on human understanding. And finally, my favorite great book, Tolstoy's War and Peace. There's my 10, and I really think that on this desert island, these 10 books could occupy me for the 10 years. I would be alive with them and growing.
Well, I'm impressed. I wasn't surprised about Aristotle. I was surprised about Montaigne, and Montaigne would be one of the ones that I would choose. Shakespeare, 2. Let me see where these are now. I wouldn't take Herodotus and Thucydides. I'd take Plutarch. Where's Montaigne? Now,
There's your 4.
that's 3.
That's 3.
That's 3.
Let me put these aside then, Charles.
All right?
Now you have 7 more to go.
Right? I'm going to get them out here. And I may surprise you in a couple of these. I won't surprise you by saying that I want to take the Iliad and the Odyssey
No,
of Homer.
I'm sure that.
Because I've read them over and over again, but I will never stop as long as I live reading these great poems, which are the beginning poems in
No question
the
about
history
it.
of Western thought, and to me define all the tasks and solutions of poetry. I would take Dante. I would take the Divine Comedy. As a matter of fact, I want the complete works of Dante because I want to read the Divine Comedy in the context of all of his other works. I would take Don Quixote.
Oh, yeah. If I
Because-
had, may I say, if I had 12 to take instead of 10,
All right.
I would take Don Quixote too.
And I decided against War and Peace
Why?
and for Cervantes because I decided I would rather spend 10 years with Sancho Panza and Don Quixote than I would with Prince Andre and Natasha and so forth.
But-
I just like these people better.
yeah.
I love Tolstoy, but I adore Cervantes.
If I had 12, I would take Cervantes and I would take Rabelais, I think.
Well, Rabelais is pretty fine, too. Finally, and here you won't agree, I would take the works of Sigmund Freud.
I took 2 theologians. You took a psychologist.
Right. But I've only got 7. I've got 3 more to do. One of them
Oh,
is
3
the
not
Bible.
in the great books?
No, they're not in the great books.
And- but you
One
think-
is the Bible.
But you think they are great books?
I think they are.
Well,
One is the Bible.
The Bible is, in a sense, in the great
It
books.
is in the set. Another one is an anthology, the best anthology that I could possibly have of lyric poetry, because I would not want to spend 10 years without lyric poetry. I wanted the best and the biggest that
That's a
there is.
comment on me that I didn't put any lyric poetry in my set.
And finally, as I would take the collected poems of my father, Mark Van Doren, because for 10 years I would want to be reminded of myself and of him and of my mother and of my wife and of my brother. My whole family is talked about in these. I think, I'm not going to say whether I think it's a great book. For me, it is a great, memorable, and a book that I can't live without.
Well, you know, I think the books we agree about, and the books we almost agree about, are I should say, the archetype, the model of what we mean by a great book. I mean, clearly, the poems of your father wouldn't work for me as they work for you.
No, but they would work for me as a great book does. I want to go back to them over and over and over again.
Yes.
And as I do that, I am always delighted. I always learn. I come to new insights about him and about myself. And what more can a great book do than that?
If we were on this desert island, each of us by himself, do you think at the end of 10 years, with our small set of books, we'd come out better men, better minds?
Oh, I'm sure we would. We would have survived. That's the first thing that was true. And in the second place, we would have come out better men. I believe so.
Well, then, you know, the experiment is one that everyone should perform.
Yeah.
Because, in fact, everyone is on a desert island.
Right.
Even though radio and TV and company is provided for everyone. Nevertheless, so far as the growth of one's mind is concerned, the desert island experiment is the real test.
Yeah.
What one does by oneself in the quiet of one's room with books in one's hand. And I think everyone should put himself to the test and ask himself what books he'd take, what books he'd surround himself with if he had to live with them for 10 years.
And then turn off the television and start to read them.
Correct.
I think that I'm very interested in the fact that there is an overlap of 3, Montaigne and
Well,
Shakespeare.
the Bible belongs, I think, with the great